and I will just ask for your permission. So welcome to the Raising Healthy TCKs workshop. This is a workshop that we do at least 3 times a year, and it's the foundational kind of cornerstone workshop on TCK training's content and methodology and ideas and that sort of thing. And so I'm really glad that you're here because this is kind of the jumping point for all of our other content. And like I just said, we are recording, and I want you to know that for 2 reasons. The first is so that if you love what you hear, you know that people can also access this workshop by looking in the recordings available on our website so they can purchase it. But also because I know some people are in sensitive environments, so if you need to keep your video off, that's fine, and just watch what you say because it is recorded and other people will be able to view and purchase it off the website. So I want to start by giving you a discount. This is for any workshops that we have available. It's $5 off, and this is good through the end of the year. This is in addition to the 20% off that we already have for 2022 workshops that's going till the end of the year. So feel free to use that coupon code. There are a lot of new workshops, both for parents and for caregivers of TCKs coming in 2022. And then we also have the archives of lots of workshops that we've done over the last couple of years. So there's a lot available, but feel free to jot down that code if you would like that $5 off. And again, that's good until the end of the year. If you love our workshops, the most cost-effective method is to do the subscriptions. We hear a lot that especially parents want so many of the workshops, but they can't pay $30 a workshop. And so we've created the parent membership, which is $17 a month. And that gets you all of the workshops, the live ones, the archives, the recordings, everything that you can want. So that's obviously a less expensive option. And then there's the TCK Caregiver workshop. Those are for people who are working with TCKs, and that gives them access to even more workshops. So they get all the parent workshops and then ones that are specifically for caregivers. And some of those are even longer trainings, like we have a 6-hour grief tower training and that sort of thing that's included in that. We have some books available, and I'm noticing that I did not change this slide from when I was just at a conference teaching this. So there are no copies available here on Zoom, but there are copies available on Amazon. And all of these books are now out and available. So there's the Raising Up a Generation of Healthy Third Culture Kids book. A lot of the content we'll look at today comes from that, but we'll go a lot deeper. We'll talk about a lot of different things, so you're not getting a verbatim of the book, but that's a great resource. The Grief Tower talks about how to process grief with TCKs, and then Unstacking Your Grief Tower just came out about 2 weeks ago. And that is for adult TCKs for processing their own grief. And just a little bit about myself as we get started. I am Lauren Wells, and I'm the founder and director of TCK Training. I am an adult TCK myself and spent time in Tanzania, East Africa. We moved there when I was 12, and before that we were in the Philippines for just a few months, and I was not aware that that was my parents' test run to see how my brother and I would do living in a different culture. And so when that went well, they told the organization, all right, I think we can go, we can do this. And so that's when we moved to Tanzania, was shortly after that. My growing up years in Tanzania were really wonderful, but also full of a lot of grief and a lot of loss. There were a lot of really hard things that happened, even just in our first 2 years in Africa. And so we'll talk about the idea of the grief tower in a little bit. But it's amazing to even think about how somebody who comes from a really loving, amazing, wonderful family can have a very small or even non-existent grief tower, and then they start the TCK life and all of a sudden it stacks up really quickly. And that's exactly what happened in our family. And so we had a lot that stacked up, a lot to process. And we also were with an organization at the time that had no member care. We didn't know what a TCK was. There was no debriefing, there was nothing. It was, we don't really know what to do with you, so good luck and hopefully they'll all be okay. So that really gave me a heart for wanting to see TCKs well cared for, because even if these circumstances are not dire, which sometimes they are, but even if they're not, they still end up with this tall grief tower that needs to be processed. And what we believe at TCK training is that we should be doing that preventively instead of reactively on the other side when they're adults. So that's why I started TCK training. And I started TCK training after working in TCK care for about 6 years. I worked for an organization developing all their TCK programs, and then was eventually the director of training for that organization for a few years. You can see a picture of my cute family. My daughter Claire is 5, she's in kindergarten, and Audrey is almost 4. So they're very sweet and very close together. So I'd love to hear a little bit about you, and you are welcome to unmute and share, or if you'd like to put it in the chat, that would be wonderful. I'd love to hear about your current role. That could be as a parent, that could be if you are doing this as a job, whatever your role is, and your history with TCK care. If there's, again, history as a parent or history as somebody who is serving TCKs in a ministry capacity or work capacity. I'd love to hear a little bit about who's here.
So did you say you prefer it in the chat, Lauren?
You're welcome to unmute and speak if you'd like to, or in the chat. Either way is fine. I have no preference.
Well, I'll just say it. I'm Rosalind Brown, and I work with UFM Worldwide in the UK. We were missionaries in West Africa, in Ivory Coast and West Africa for a number of years. We had 4 kids then, and we had 2 evacuations that were quite traumatic. So for the last 6 or 7 years, I've been working in member care with UFM Worldwide, and TCKs are my passion, mainly because, like you, I didn't fully understand what my kids were experiencing till much later, and I would have been so helpful had I had this sort of training before.
I'm so glad you're here. Thank you for being here and for giving back what you didn't have to other TCKs. It's wonderful. Let's see a few in the chat. Let's see. So Emily with member care with organization, primarily talk with adult TCKs at the moment. Wonderful. So that Unstacking Your Grief Tower book might be a good resource to pass along. I have heard that it's helpful. It's always one of those things that you never know until people read it, whether it's actually helpful, but I've now had a few people reach out and say that it's legitimately helpful. So that's great to hear. Let's see, Elisa
Can you hear
says,
me? Am I unmuted? Okay.
You are not.
No,
Go ahead, Brett.
No, you can keep going with, you're about to read another comment, and then I can go after that.
Okay. So Elisa or Alyssa says, I just started working with Barnabas International, but have been living overseas since I was just out of college with ELIC Pinnacle Teaching. I was with member care with my org for about 12 out of the 18 years. Wonderful. I'm so glad you're here. I just was at PTM teaching for lots and lots of hours. It was one of those, like, I had no voice by the end of my 15 hours of teaching or whatever. So got to meet a lot of Barnabas staff. So it's wonderful to see you here. All right, Brett, go ahead.
Okay, so I'm here under, I guess, yeah, a couple hats, like you said. So I work with a small missions organization called Global Partners in Hope, and worked for 15 years in Mali and Togo in West Africa. I'm also a pediatrician and treat I'll do a lot with all ages, a lot of adolescent mental health, and do a lot with missionary kids as well. But I'm still very new to the TCK part of it, despite having 4 kids of my own that I raised in West Africa. So ranging from 16 years to 7, and we just moved back last year. And yeah, we had like Rosalind said, we had a few, I think we had 4 like withdrawal evacuation type scenarios. One that was especially fast and difficult in Mali. And so my kids, still trying to work through helping my kids through that, and did appreciate your book, the Grief Tower book. That was very good. We appreciated that. We all read it. Anyway, that's enough for me.
I'm so glad you're here. And I think and hope you will enjoy a lot of the information we'll talk about today, because it does touch on that kind of medical, mental health, but how it applies in a TCK context element. So I would love for you to chime in if there's anything in there in that section that you would like to share with us on.
Sure,
I'm going to read a couple more in the chat. So Sarah Jetter said she's a training facilitator of Mercy Ships, working with the kids onboarding program. Awesome. That's so wonderful. Do you know Rami? So Rami works with Mercy Ships now in the Netherlands, but she was in Texas working with the kids onboarding program for a long time. And a long time ago, when I was working with the other organization, I worked with her to develop curriculum for culture learning and language acquisition for those kids. So I have a bit of history with Mercy Ships. So it's so glad that you're here. Wilma said, I have 3 TCKs myself, plus 2 TCKs living with me from South Korea, a foster child starting to work as a TCK caregiver. Wonderful. Well, it's so great to meet all of you. I'm so glad that you're here, and I hope that you all enjoyed hearing from each other too. One thing that I love about teaching workshops is that we get to connect with one another, and I really appreciate that. I think we all work in a very kind of niche space, and so it's helpful to hear from one another and interact with each other and be able to say, oh yeah, I met somebody from Mercy Ships at a workshop. Even though it's virtual and it's different than in person, it's still nice to have these connections. The last thing I want to talk about before we move into our content is that we do have a new program called Pathways. And this is a full 12-week course for anyone working in TCK care to be very, very well educated in TCK care, how to do your job well. It is everything from how to work in your role logistically to program planning to age-based care. It comes with the debriefing certification. And our pilot program starts in the spring, and we have some amazing instructors. One of the things that we wanted to do with this program is not have it just be TCK training content. So we have Interaction International teaching one of the weeks. We have Chris O'Shaughnessy teaching a week, Tanya Crossman, Melissa Shipman, and some other people who you may have heard of in the TCK care world. So just keep that in mind as you think about next year. I saw one more in the comments. So Sharon is a parent of 3 TCKs and also doing member support for families, particularly transition support. Wonderful. I am so glad you're here. It is fascinating how so many in TCK care have all of the roles. You're a parent and you're doing member care and you're this and you're that. And so I love to do workshops that are for all audiences, because often we all fit in all of them, right? We all have a hand in all of those different elements. So we're going to start with some definitions, and you probably know these if you are working in TCK care, but it is important to make sure that we all have the same foundational information. So very quickly, the definition that we like to use and stick with is from the Third Culture Kids book by Pollock and Van Riken. And it's that a third culture kid is a person who's spent a significant part of his or her developmental years outside the parent's culture. They build relationships to all cultures while not having full ownership in any. Although elements from each culture are assimilated into the TCK's life experience, the sense of belonging is in relationship to others of the same background or other TCKs. We call that definition traditional TCKs. And at TCK training, we make the distinction, and this is one of those, like, it depends on who you're talking to, but at TCK training, we make the distinction that a traditional TCK is somebody who has the intent of repatriation at some point. So they move to a different country, but there is the intent that they will repatriate at some point, or will at least make regular treks back to their passport country. They are not immigrating permanently. They are not people who are refugees who are landing permanently into a new place. There's that element of intent for repatriation. So just so you know that that is how we talk about very traditional TCKs. But then everything else falls into cross-cultural kids, or CCKs. So these are also traditional TCKs. They're just under that bigger umbrella. But then also you have the bi and multicultural children, children of biracial parents, domestic TCKs, which are the ones living in their passport country, but within a minority group. I just worked with a whole group of domestic TCKs who are living outside of Atlanta, but in a really small city where it is entirely refugee filled. It feels like you are not in this country. It feels like you're not in America. And so these families are missionaries in that city in Atlanta, but living in a very cross-cultural context. And so I was very pleased that they reached out for TCK care, and that somebody was wise enough to say, yes, you need this. But they're domestic TCKs. So that's what we're talking about in that category. Children of minorities, children of immigrants, international adoptees, and educational CCKs. All of the stuff that we're going to talk about is most prominent in the traditional TCK category, but a lot of it applies to all of these other areas as well. So it's not that it doesn't count for any of these, it's just that it shows up in its most extreme form in the traditional TCKs, but you could apply this in all of these areas. And I'm sure your role ends up kind of crossing over in some of these areas as well. When we talk about the third culture kid and their culture, it's not that we're mixing two different cultures. We're not saying that they have different cultural elements from the geographical locations, and that's what makes them a TCK. We're saying that it's its own unique culture. And this is why someone who is born in Singapore and raised in Europe has things in common with somebody born in America and raised in Tanzania. It's not about the geographic locations. It's about the fact that we all have these experiences of being a globally mobile child living outside of where our parents' roots were developed, and that gives us common shared characteristics. What TCK training does with all of this is we come alongside parents and sending entities for the purpose of equipping, encouraging, and empowering them to raise healthy third culture kids. Because one thing that we have seen is that the more research we have done, the more we find that adult TCKs really struggle. Adult CCKs also, but again, most extreme form is in traditional TCKs. When I was working at Culture Bound, the organization I was with a few years ago, I was talking to parents who were just about to get on the plane to go wherever they were going. And that was right about the same time that all of these statistics were coming out about how much adult TCKs were struggling. I was in my early 20s and I was in counseling because I was really struggling. And I remember having this moment of thinking, do I actually think this is a good idea? I am really struggling. There's all these statistics, and now I'm standing here talking to all these families who are about to get on their airplane with these little kids, and I'm looking at these little kids and thinking, is this a good idea? Or do I need a new career? Because I don't know if I believe that this is a good idea. And so I did a lot of soul searching and research and looking into and studying prevention science and trying to figure out, okay, if the benefits are true, which they are, that there are so many amazing benefits, how can we bring those to light and counteract some of these really negative manifestations of the challenges in order for them to be healthy? Because it's great to talk about the benefits of the TCK life, but you don't get to use those and experience those very well if you're not healthy. You're not going to be a good leader if you're not healthy. You're not going to be a good caregiver. You're not going to be a good human services worker if you are not healthy. So how can we grow them into healthy third culture kids so that they really can impact society in amazing ways, which is something that so many people have said about TCKs for decades, is they can be amazing contributors to society. Yes, but they have to be healthy or that doesn't go well. So I went on this journey to really dissect how do we help them to be healthy. And TCK training is all about, again, equipping, encouraging, and empowering those who love TCKs to raise them up in healthy ways. And that doesn't mean that that you need to be a super perfect parent or a super perfect caregiver, but just that there are some unique things that can be helpful as you love on TCKs. So through that, we talk about preventive care. And I mentioned that I studied a lot of prevention science and really was trying to figure out, okay, so if people in the global world are trying to figure out how to prevent things, what are they doing to get there? And how do we apply that to the TCK experience? What does preventive care look like? And it's not about taking away the challenges. That was something that had to be kind of discovered at the beginning. That I realized, well, we can't take away the challenges. You can't reduce the grief. You can't control the environment. You can only to a point. You can't take away the challenges. And actually, we don't want to, because a lot of the benefits come from them. You don't get to be super empathetic without experiencing your own grief. You don't get to be really adaptable without having a lot of change. All of those things are directly related to the benefits, but how do we then keep those challenges from manifesting in debilitating ways? And that's what this is all about. So preventive care includes these 4 elements that spell out care: conversations, awareness, relationship, and example. And we'll look at each of these areas, but this is just a helpful grid for you to think about: what are the things we need to be talking about? What do I need to know as a parent or caregiver? How does this relationship impact them? Because relationship, as you will see, is what I argue is the most important element. And then how can we be an example to them in the things that maybe we never expected we needed to model? We'll talk about modeling grief processing. And I don't know how many of you have thought, I need to make sure that I am showing and modeling my own methods of grief processing to this 5-year-old that I'm working with. But those are things that we really need to be doing because they need to see how these things are done in healthy ways. A preventive approach comes from the awareness that practitioners have about the long-term manifestations of TCK challenges that go unaddressed. So anytime I'm working with a family, anytime you're working with a family, or you are working with your own children, trying to think about, okay, this is what this looks like now. What does this look like, though, if it is unaddressed 20 years later? For example, there is a pretty consistent trend that I see where there are a lot of firstborn girls who tend to kind of carry the emotional weight of the family. And they feel like it's their job to keep everybody above water and to kind of set the emotional equilibrium for the family. When your family is in really tough situations, often that means that you are continually playing that role, growing in that role, using that role. And in the TCK context, you're often praised for that role. You get a lot of praise for how awesome you are at holding everyone together and putting on a happy face and all of those things. Does anyone know what that has a tendency to turn into in adulthood? And the definition would be caring for other people's emotions at the expense of your own.
It's a 2 on the Enneagram. I don't know what the definition is.
A 2 on the Enneagram. It could, could
an
be
unhealthy 2. Yeah.
An unhealthy 2. Yes. And that is called codependency. Emily put it in the chat. Good job, Emily. Codependency. And so we look at what these children are struggling with now with the thought of, how do we prevent this from going this direction consistently later? I was just debriefing a family, and one of the sons, he was getting into teenage years, so he was getting bigger and stronger. And he had the tendency, when things were really hard, to get really angry and get physical with his younger siblings. And it was not to the point where I felt like calling protective services was necessary, but it was to the point where I had to sit the parents down and say, this is what this looks like now. He is getting bigger and stronger. What do you imagine this might look like if he's 30 and married and has his own children? That's what preventive care is all about, is saying, okay, this is what this looks like now. What does this look like down the road if it's not addressed? So that's what this preventive approach is, and lots of different facets of TCK care. A preventive approach also gives parents awareness and practical intentionality in TCK care. I often say you can't be intentional unless you're aware. It's really hard to make intentional changes without awareness. So we give parents awareness, but we also give practical intentionality. And that's often where that hope and encouragement comes in, is there are things you can do. There are things you can do practically, and it is not anything that is overwhelmingly impossible. It's not huge. It's things like laugh more. And we'll talk about all these different elements of preventive care, but I want parents to hear that it is not something that is impossible. It's not an impossible feat. It just takes awareness and intentionality. It looks at the long-term socio-emotional well-being of the TCK. We want to help them to move forward in healthier ways from whatever stage they're in. How do we continue to go through challenges, and with each challenge learn something and move forward in healthier ways instead of being set back further? That's called resiliency. When you learn something and you move forward in healthier ways and then can tackle the next challenge with a new set of skills. That's what we want to be doing for TCKs. We want to increase resiliency instead of having them increase in fragility, which is often what we see. It also considers the whole family unit. We always, when we work with TCKs, require time with the parents, because it's impossible for us to, one, know the kids as well as the parents know their kids. That is not possible. But also, we cannot continue the care like the parents can. It is really up to the parents to carry forward this care for their TCKs. And so we need to consider the whole family unit. And then finally, it's a hope-filled approach. We come at this from a place of hope, from a place of encouragement, and a place of saying, yes, I know that a lot of these things seem really dire, but there is hope. And I would not be doing this if I didn't think that being a TCK was a great experience and something that is a really wonderful thing. But we also have to have this preventive care alongside. So we're going to look at understanding the elements of preventive care, understanding the practical application. We're going to learn about some preventive care resources, and then how to provide excellent preventive care. And this could be your approach, whether you are a parent or a caregiver or just somebody who is a friend of a TCK. There are lots of ways that you can provide this. So why do we need prevention? These come from a study done back in 2016. We are actually currently conducting the largest research study ever done on adult third culture kids. We currently have about 1,500 responses, and we are keeping it open until the end of the year. So our goal was 1,200. So we've exceeded the goal. By the end of the year, we'll have hopefully very much exceeded the goal. And we're looking for the things that adult TCKs say they struggled with growing up. So we'll have those statistics. But for now, here are some of the things that we see. We see that 90% feel out of sync with their peers in their passport culture throughout their lifetime. That is significant because most TCKs end up repatriating to their passport country and tend to live there for the remainder of their lifetime. Most TCKs do not turn around and live their own TCK life. Some of them do, but a lot of them don't. And even if they do, there's usually a significant period of time, an average of 10 years, that they're living in their passport country while they're going to university, maybe getting married, starting their career, and then maybe they travel after that. But there's still a lot of time when they are living there. I had somebody once say, well, so wouldn't the solution be that they need to find other TCKs to befriend? Well, yes, and that would be a great solution if there were a wealth of adult TCKs all over the place. But you have people like me who went to a very small university in Indiana where I was probably the only TCK, and there was certainly no way to find other adult TCKs if they were there. There was not a program for that. And then we, about a year and a half ago, moved to a small town in South Carolina. I have yet to find another adult TCK. That does not mean that I should not be able to have deep relationships, right? And so if we make the solution, well, they just need to find other TCKs, that can be really difficult because there becomes a point when maybe that's not as readily available. A lot of people really love the book Swirly, and actually can see it right here on my bookshelf, so I'll pull it out. The book Swirly, I love this book. I think that this book is great, but anytime I teach through this book, I make the caveat at the end that you can be friends with other people who also aren't swirly like you. Because the end of that book is that she has a really hard time until she finds somebody else who's swirly like her. That's great. But what if you don't? And so this idea that 90% feel out of sync with their peers is important because that's common. And because when you have that out of sync feeling, that tends to lead to loneliness, isolation, and depression, and even suicide. And so again, we're looking at what does this look like if it's not cared for? And unfortunately, we see that in a lot of adult TCKs. We know that 80% struggle with depression and anxiety as adults. A lot of that we believe stems from that unresolved grief, that tall grief tower that we'll talk about in a little bit. We know that suicides are more common among TCKs than monocultural individuals. One reason we think that this could be a factor, and we'll cover this in our research, but one reason we think this could be a factor, our hypothesis, is that often it's in those really difficult first 10 years that the ATCKs are back in their passport country, that their parents are not around. And so you don't have a lot of supportive adult relationships coming alongside them in those really critical years. So that's something that we need to think about. We also need to look at adults who are living cross-culturally. Believe it or not, we are the first to put side by side the statistics on adults who are living overseas and the TCKs. But the reality is the health of the parent directly impacts the health of their kids. And so if we know that they have 2.5 times higher rates of mental illness than monoculturals, and that 50% struggle with depression and anxiety disorders while living in a different country. So they maybe didn't experience it until they moved abroad. Now they're really struggling. That impacts their children. I just taught a few weeks ago in person, which was wonderful. And I had talked about these statistics, and one of the moms there just started crying. And I asked if anybody wanted to share, and she said that this was her experience the first 2 years that they lived abroad, and her kids are now adults, but they moved abroad, and the first 2 years she was severely depressed, and she had 2 toddlers. So she had moved abroad with 2 toddlers. Her husband was working and traveling all the time. She couldn't speak the language, and she was severely depressed. And she said, I have had to come around to both my kids and apologize to them as adults because I know that I neglected them in those 2 years. I know that they did not get any intentional care from mom because she was barely functioning. The health of parents directly impacts the health of kids. And so if we know that adult expats tend to struggle, we need to think about how that impacts their children, because it's an important correlation. And that's why we talked about preventive care, looking at the whole family unit. Elisa said adult teammates can impact them too. Yes, absolutely. I'm assuming you're meaning if the adult teammates are not doing well, or if they are doing well, they can be helpful.
Both.
I think that's
Both.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. For sure. So we see 3 things that contribute to these statistics that need to be talked about and addressed. There are certainly more than this that contribute, but these are the things that for TCKs we really want to key in on and see how we can prevent these, because we believe that when we can really intentionally prevent in these areas, that makes a huge difference for TCKs. So we'll look at toxic stress and high ACE scores, but then we'll also go through these key challenge areas of emotional health, identity, subconscious expectations, grief and loss, and their need for change. So toxic stress and ACE scores, these are 2 things that we tend to see a lot of, especially when we're debriefing families, that we find that they have higher levels of toxic stress, or we hear about how they're really struggling in school and hear that before school started, all of these different things happened and stacked on their tower, and it's probably put them in this really high stress zone. Or they have some ACE scores that are from reasons that are kind of uncommon in the rest of the world, but common in the TCK life. So we're going to talk about what those are. Toxic stress results from strong, frequent, or prolonged activations of the body's stress systems in response to stressful environments and in the absence of a supportive adult relationship. I have had a lot of parents say, but I'm the supportive adult relationship. Yes, but there are often times when your stress levels are too high to be enough of a supportive relationship to counteract that toxic stress that your kids are experiencing. We talk about toxic stress by talking about the red zone, and the idea is that their brains go into the red zone when they are stressed. And that's what all of our brains do. There's the amygdala that says something's stressing us. We need to pump adrenaline and cortisol, and it pumps the stress hormones on our brain. And that's good. That is supposed to happen because that's how we stay out of danger and stay alive. What's not healthy and helpful is when it stays that way for too long. The red zone short term is resilience building. Every time you are in the red zone and get out of it and back into the green zone, it builds resilience and helps you to do that better the next time. The red zone long term or without a supportive adult, though, is harmful and can be traumatizing. So again, we're not trying to take away stress. We're trying to keep it from being too long and having their brain be in that stressed red zone system for too long. As I was saying, there's a common challenge in the TCK life where the increased stress of life and on the parents is at the same time as the emotional needs of the children are increasing. So it's during those seasons of transition, of trying to figure out how to buy groceries when you can't speak the language, of applying for visas, of evacuations. It's during those times that the children's emotional needs are the highest, and the parents are often too stressed out to provide really great care. That's why supportive adult relationships other than parents are also really important. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Sometimes the parents need other people to be a supportive adult relationship and meet those emotional needs for their kids. But sometimes when we know that there's a season where there's going to be increased stress, it is important to plant things that are preventive in that season. And that's what I talk with families about a lot. Okay, you know you have a transition coming up. I want you to plan one night a week where your only goal is to get everyone in the family laughing. That is your only goal. You can have a pillow fight, you can watch a funny movie, you can play a silly game. Your only goal is to get everybody laughing once a week, because you know these weeks are going to be stressful, and that's going to get everyone up for air at least once a week during that stressful time. So we need to make sure that we're helping them to plant things along the way that help meet those emotional needs. Back to the red zone. The red zone can come when there's a strong big T trauma. These are things that are intensely traumatic, things like rape or a life-threatening situation, those sorts of things that are big T traumas. Those are not as common, but that does automatically put them in the red zone. Frequent is more common. This is when there's constant re-exposure into the situation or environment that's causing the red zone. That could be maybe a school situation. So you talk about a child who's entering a new school, and maybe every day they show up at the school, they go into the red zone and they're there all day long. And they come home and get back to the green zone, and then they go back to school and they're in the red zone. And what happens with frequent is it turns into prolonged if it doesn't get better, because they start to anticipate the morning before heading to school that they're going to be in the red zone. And so then they get there the morning before, and then it's the night before that they can't sleep because they have school the next day. And then it's before they leave school the previous day that they're worried about school the next day. And so it turns into prolonged. It is not uncommon for TCKs to be in this frequent red zone for a while, and for that to not be a bad thing. But what we want to see is that it's going from red to, we'll say, orange to yellow to green, and that we're getting toward the green zone over a period of about 3 months. We are at about that point in the school year. And so what I'm doing with a lot of the families who I coach and talk to on a monthly basis is checking in to see where they are. Are they feeling like their kids are still in the red? Are they more orange? Are they yellow? Are they back in the green? How are they doing? Because we should see that it's heading toward green in these 3 months. Because what happens if it isn't is that it gets worse. I actually just did have to tell a family who I was debriefing. Their kids are not doing well. They came back to America. They were evacuated, came back to America, and are in a school situation that is very sterile because of COVID. And so there's no social time. There's no recess. There's no lunch. They have all of their desks in these plexiglass boxes, and that's where they sit all day, and that's where they eat their lunch every day. And they're not allowed to leave their plexiglass box except to go to the bathroom, and they can only go to the bathroom by themselves. And so what the parent was asking is, they're not doing well, but is this normal? Because I know they do, like, transitions are hard anyway. And so my advice to her, my comment was, they are in the red zone, and you're right, that is normal. It is normal for them to be in the red zone for about the first 3 months, but we want to see it get better. What's not normal is that everything that would usually help them get to the green zone is gone. All of the things that would be positive inputs that would help them get that direction has been taken away. And so we need to consider that, and also not just say, oh, well, I guess it's just a wash and this year's just going to be bad. But if by Christmas they are still deep in the red zone and you're still seeing all of these signals and symptoms and triggers, we need a different plan, because they can't go the entire school year this far in the red zone. And if we're not seeing improvement by Christmas, let's have another conversation. That's what we're talking about frequent re-exposure. That could also be true for a marketplace setting that's really stressful, or if they have a nanny who is maybe doesn't speak their language and that's really stressful to them. So social situations, different things that are constantly re-exposing them to the red zone. And then again, if it's not getting better when it's frequent, it often turns into prolonged. This is if it's over 3 months. So again, once we hit that 3-month mark, we want to see that they're at least in the orange yellow zone, if not the green zone. After that, that's too long. Some things that we see when they are in the red zone are developmental reverting. This is anything that the parent says, I thought we were out of this stage and now we're back there. That could be with potty training. That could be with being attached to a stuffed animal. That could be separation anxiety. That could be an older kid starting to act like a younger kid. Developmental reverting is something that is a symptom of the red zone. And again, if you see these things, that doesn't mean that they're in the red zone for too long. That should just be an indicator that, oh, we're here in the red zone. We need to work to get out of it. It should raise awareness. Behavioral challenges are a really common one. I always say that if there are uncharacteristic behavioral challenges, and it's during a season of transition or during some sort of difficult season, it's probably the red zone. It's probably not just that they've randomly had this horrible season of behavior. There's probably more to it. Lack of learning. It is impossible for our brains to take in and retain new information when we are in the red zone. So if there is a lack of learning, that is a symptom. I just debriefed a college student this summer who had been evacuated. So COVID was during her senior year in Africa. She missed graduation, things were shut down. They were evacuated, given 24 hours to leave. They came back, everything was crazy when they got back here. Lots of things happened throughout the summer. And then she started university and she had a terrible roommate situation. And it was a very isolated university setting. And she did not do well. This person was an amazing student back in the international school and had a 4.0 grade point average, was doing phenomenal. She finished her first year of college with a 1.6 grade point average and was not doing well. And her parents reached out to me to say, we need to get her grades up. I don't know what's going on. Can you help? And I said, we need to get her in the green zone so that her brain can actually function well enough to think about grades. It's not that there's a lack of desire or a lack of care for grades. It's that her brain is in the red zone and cannot retain and process and learn new information. So no wonder she didn't learn anything that year. So lack of learning, that could be any age, but that's a really great indicator. Also is a reason why I always encourage that no one ever tries to diagnose learning disabilities in the first year in a new place. Because if they're in the red zone and they have this lack of ability to learn, they look like they're not doing well on a learning level. And I had another family who I was just working with this year who said somebody was, a teacher was suggesting that they were evaluated for learning disabilities. And I said, well, you're welcome to do the assessment, but I would never, ever suggest doing that in the first year, let alone the first 3 months. We're still in that normal red zone phase after a transition in a new school, in a new country, learning in a new language. Like, of course, they're going to get diagnosed with something. So just another caveat there. Another one is social anxiety. This is particularly if this was not something they struggled with before, that all of a sudden there's a lot of anxiety in a social situation. This could be because they are overwhelmed by all the stimuli. There's just too much going on in their life that another social environment is too much. I often see this when families have a year of support raising and they're at a different church every Sunday. That's a lot for kids. That is a lot. And if they start to become really socially anxious, that's a good sign that that system is putting them into the red zone. Sometimes this shows up when it's somebody who speaks the language of the place where they are that puts them in the red zone. I had a family who there was a they had a nanny for their toddler who only spoke to him in the local language, and they were doing language immersion. Well, he did not do well and really, really struggled with that nanny, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. But really, really struggled. And then anytime that he was with anybody who spoke that language, he would get panicky and would start to be really anxious and would not do well. And the parents were worried that it was a diversity issue, that there was some sort of lack of, I don't know, there's some sort of prejudice going on. And I said, well, I think he's probably being triggered by this language because that is a very, very connected to those times when he was left with this nanny and couldn't communicate his needs to the person caring for him. And that feels very triggering. So sometimes social anxiety shows up with a language situation. And that's something I've heard more than once, which is why I mention it. Emotional outbursts is something else that is very common in the red zone. And with all of these, but especially emotional outbursts, it's always, if this is not normal for that child and we're noticing it, they're probably in the red zone. And we need to figure out what's going on that's gotten them there. Sometimes it's really obvious. There are obvious red zone stages where I tell families, you're going to be in the red zone. Let's work on planting things to help get you in the green zone throughout it. But then there are other times that we don't know why that child's in the red zone, but we know that we see the symptoms. And so we need to be investigating. Is there something going on at school? Is there a bullying situation? Are they worried about something? What's going on that's putting that child in the red zone? To get to the green zone requires co-regulation. And all that means is someone is coming alongside the child to get them into the green zone. When babies are infants, they are entirely externally regulated. They are not expected to regulate themselves. They are regulated by a caregiver who is rocking them and singing to them and shushing them and rubbing their back and doing things to regulate them. As kids get older, they become co-regulated, but that should increase in stages, gradually increase, that they are less and less co-regulated as they get older. And ideally, when our kids grow up and go off into adulthood, they should be pretty well self-regulated. That's the idea, that's the goal. What happens that keeps kids in the red zone is that there's no one who is paying attention or aware or not stressed themselves enough to come alongside and co-regulate with them. And sometimes we forget that even teenagers need co-regulation. Sometimes we are really attuned to the toddler who needs that, but we forget that the 14-year-old also still needs to be co-regulated in some ways. Some ways that we can help them do that are through rhythm. Anything that involves rhythm has been proven to regulate our brains. That's anybody, adults, kids, teenagers. Think about that the next time you're very stressed out. Anything that involves rhythm. That could be making music or playing music or listening to music. That could be going for a walk. Walking is rhythmic. That could be swinging on a swing set. That could be coloring. Coloring is a rhythmic motion. That could be just like clapping. I have taught some kids who are in the red zone and just really anxious to just like tap on their legs and just use their hands to tap on their legs in class. And that can be regulating and rhythmic. But anything that's rhythmic is really, really helpful. With teenagers, a teenage tip is co-regulation often works best when you do it kind of covertly. And so you say things like, I'm going to go for a walk. Would you like to join me? Or I think that I'm going to do this art page or do this art thing. Do you want to do it with me? So instead of saying, I think you need to do this, say, would you like to join me in whatever it is? Fun and laughter is another way to get to the green zone. When we laugh, our brain says, oh, I guess everything's fine. It's all good. We can calm down now. So fun and laughter. An emotionally safe person, emotionally safe space. This is because when we talk through things with somebody who listens, it helps us to access that piece of our brain that's causing us to get into the red zone. And when we can access that with both sides of our brain, so the logical side and the emotional side, that helps it to stop being so triggering. It helps it to calm down a little bit. And so when there's an emotionally safe person to talk to about it, it helps it to kind of ease up because it's not just stuck in our brain. We're actually accessing it emotionally and logically. And then finally, supportive adult relationships. We'll look at this in a little bit when we talk about positive childhood experiences. But research has shown that having two supportive adult relationships other than parents at all times, and those ones can change, they don't have to be the same two, but that is really important for children. And I think the reason why is because a lot of the time, those supportive adult relationships are really awesome at all of the things on this list. Those supportive relationships are the ones who are more funny than mom and dad, or who are better at saying, let's go for a walk and let's go together. And they actually want to go, of taking them out for coffee and having a conversation, of just playing. So supportive adult relationships are really, really important. So I would love to hear from you all. How have you seen this toxic stress idea, this idea of red zone to green zone, play out in the lives of TCKs that you know? And how might your relationship get them out of the red zone, or how might it help them stay in the green zone? So preventively keeping them in the green zone. And you're welcome to answer any other questions that you have, or ask any questions that you have too. I'm going to answer a question that came in the chat. Alyssa said, how does this work with 2s and 3s? Red zone during the transition and after? It usually shows up in those behavior, developmental reverting, all of those things. And so a lot of it with those kids is that almost entirely externally regulating. So getting them externally regulated by saying, let's turn on music and have a dance party, or let's color, or let's go swing, doing the things that they think you're just having a good time, but you know, this is rhythm, this is regulating, this is getting them to the green zone. And they need to be almost entirely externally regulated during those really significant red zone times.
So I asked that question because I have been working with a family that was in my old organization all year because they live proximately close to me. And they have a 3-year-old, well, she's getting older now, she's almost 4, but they have a 3-year-old. Their son was born in Thailand during COVID. They were in lockdown. They finally got back to the States. They lived in so many places this past 2 years. And they finally found a place near me where they hunkered down, but they've also had change in their team constantly, even though their team all lived with them, which was awesome in the States while they were teaching in China online. And she is just so different than she was as a toddler before her brother showed up, and her brother had tons of developmental issues. So they just have so many things coming at, like, this poor girl has so many things coming at her, and the whole family does. But in so many ways, she has been neglected and now is like the trouble child because she is acting out so much. And I really feel for them because they're trying so hard with both of their kids, and they have a lot of a decent amount of TCK knowledge because of the member care in our org. But I just feel like they're drowning with her, especially because there's so much need from her little brother on top of it. So I was like, oh my gosh, I've seen this in her so much. And I do relate to getting her in the green zone, but she's been in the red or yellow or orange, but I don't know that she's been in the green the whole time she's been home. Because I don't know if we know what green looks like for her because she was so young when all of this happened. And then she got a new brother, which complicated everything. So,
Yeah. Thank you for sharing. I think when they've been in the red zone for a long time, it can take a long time to get out of it. It's not one night of laughter, right? It takes a long time. It also sounds like she really needs people other than her parents to come alongside her. And so the first thing I thought of is like having time where she can have a caregiver one-on-one, take her and do something fun. And yeah, I mean, I'm thinking like even if they had a nanny once a week who could just come and play with her and spend time with her, that would be helpful to have that consistency if the parents can't provide it as much. But yeah, that's a really difficult situation because it's going to take her a while to get out of the red zone. And sometimes it takes longer when they're that little because they almost have to mature to the point of being cognitively able to recognize what's going on too. And so when she's able to have more conversations about it, that will help. But yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing. Can you tell me how to pronounce your name so I don't?
Alisa. It's hard.
Alisa. Okay.
Yeah.
I have a cousin who's married to an Alyssa that's spelled the same way. So, you know. Rosalind said, I'm working with a TCK who's triggered by memories of a terrorist event that she did not witness, but heard a lot about when she was younger. So in a church on Sunday, when a family of a recent victim of a terrorist attack was prayed for, she had to leave the building. Is this a case of her grief tower not having been effectively unstacked, or is this a red zone situation that has a particular trigger? What do I advise her parents to do to support her? That's a great question. So that sounds less like red zone and more like an unprocessed grief tower block. And if there's an unprocessed grief tower block, anything related to that is still going to be triggering. And so I would look into the different ways of processing. The Grief Tower book would be helpful for that. We also just did a workshop that was called Processing 101, and the recording's available for that. And it's all about the idea that in order to kind of unstick that block from their brain, they need to access it with their emotional brain and their rational brain. And we talk about two sides of the brain and the kind of memory being stuck back here, and you have to walk yourself back and pick it up and move forward. And anyhow, great metaphors. Elizabeth teaches that one. But all of my advice is in that workshop. I think trying to support her through processing that block, because that says to me that block is still needing to be processed. It's still, it's still triggering. The girl is 16 years old. Yeah. If she's 16, she would probably very much benefit from doing that workshop herself too. It's very interactive, and you might think about sending it along to her and having her just focus on that block.
Thank you.
Let's see. Wilma said they use this in foster care as well. Yes, we finally bought some swings. They get used by our teens the most. Something simple but so helpful. Yeah, absolutely. I always say that what's good for TCKs is good for all kids. We just have to be a little bit more proactive with the TCKs, but it's good for all kids. All right, we're going to take a short break. It is 3 after the hour my time, so let's come back at 10 after the hour, and we will keep going. All right, we will continue on. Thank you, Brett, for your comment. He said that he tends to view the treatment of triggering events similar to phobias, and thus the person needs desensitization, and that they process the event and talk through it over and over again until they no longer have that release of emotions or adrenaline that's happening. Yes, absolutely. In that Processing 101 workshop, we're basically giving lots of different ways for processing it and thus desensitizing. So yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you, Brett. So the next thing that we need to talk about are ACE scores. The idea of ACE scores is that the CDC, along with Kaiser Permanente, originally did a study to see what childhood experiences impact adults. So the idea being the more of these ACE scores that you have, the more you have chances of behavioral issues, physical and mental health issues, that sort of thing. It's important to realize that this is a correlation, not causation study. So they looked at a lot of people and looked at how many collectively they had of these ACE scores and how many collectively they had of these behavioral, mental, physical health challenges. So they weren't looking one-to-one. What we're doing at TCK training in our research study is we are tallying up the ACE scores that we see in adult TCKs and the average number of ACE scores an individual TCK has. So that's something that we are researching and looking into. But it's important to look at these because these are significant. And what we call these in our trainings on the grief tower is we call these the boulders on the grief tower. So you have the stones on the grief tower, but then you have the ACE scores that are the boulders, and those should not be picked up alone. And one thing that we teach a lot about in our debrief certification training is when your job ends, if you're a caregiver, when your job ends and a professional of some sort's job begins. Because it's really important to know when you're working with families where those lines are. One of those lines is these ACE scores. So we're going to talk about them for the purpose of knowing how to prevent them, but also if you're a caregiver or a parent to know if these are something that you see a TCK experience and struggle with, that would be something that we would suggest a professional, medical professional, mental health professional follow up with. So in the abuse category, we have physical, emotional, and sexual. Physical abuse for TCKs does not usually happen at the hands of a parent. The ways that we have heard and seen this show up are physical abuse from a local caregiver who uses a physical form of discipline because that's a cultural norm. In extreme cases, it is a dorm parent who has used a physical form of discipline. Sometimes it's that it is a culture where everyone parents everyone else's kids. And sometimes that involves physical discipline. I worked with a family where the son had been playing with his friend who was a local and they got into trouble. And the dad put them both on the ground, pulled their pants down, and whipped them with sticks to the point of leaving scars. That was something that I said, this would be something that needs to be followed up with a professional. This isn't something we're going to be processing in our typical debrief because that goes to another level. So that's what we're talking about in that category. Not usually the parents. Sometimes it's a cultural situation. Sometimes it's just a different person. Emotional abuse is when someone's emotions are used to shame, manipulate, or harm them, or when the parent is intentionally using that child's emotions against them. Sometimes this could be in the form of even like blackmail. Sometimes this could be in the form of saying, you are going to go to hell if you cry. Sometimes this is in the form of saying that if you are upset, you're going to make it so that we have to go back to our passport country and you don't want that to be on you because that would be your fault. things like that that are using emotions to shame, manipulate, or harm, instead of saying you are allowed to feel that emotion and we can make this decision. It's not saying we need to give into emotion. It is saying if you're using emotions to shame, manipulate, or harm, that's abuse, and that's not something that is okay. Sexual abuse can be as extreme as a rape situation, but it could be also any sort of being shown pornography. It could be child to child sexual abuse. It could be groping, things like that, that are maybe sometimes for TCKs, things that they wouldn't consider sexual abuse because it was not as extreme as a rape situation. That's something that I hear from a lot of college age TCKs when we talk about these ACE scores, and we're really careful to outline these things very clearly in our research study, because working with college age TCKs, when I was doing this anecdotally, they would say, oh yeah, no, don't have any of that. Okay, well, what about? And then I would go into more details and they'd say, oh, I mean, yeah, that happened all the time, or this happened all the time. Okay, well, that still counts, even if it's not quite at this extreme level. In the neglect category, we have physical and emotional. Physical neglect is when a child's physical needs are not met by the person caring for them. When I work with families and they want to do language immersion, I always recommend that they make sure that there is somebody who speaks the child's language nearby. It is fine if you want the child to have a nanny who just speaks their local language so that they can learn it, but they need to know that if I am trying to communicate my needs to this person and they're not understanding, I have a lifeline. I have somebody that I can go to. So there are plenty of parents who are working from home and have a nanny come and speak the language in the home, but the parent is in the office and available if needed. That's a fine situation. But if there are situations where the child's being left with somebody for maybe hours at a time who doesn't speak their language, that can feel like they are physically neglected. It is really important with all of these to remember that it is the perspective of the child that matters. It is how they are perceiving it. So even if the parent says, well, I know it's a competent adult who can anticipate my child's needs and take care of them. Well, yes, but does the child feel like that? Or do they feel like she can't understand me and I'm trying to tell her whatever my needs are? An extreme form of physical neglect is when families choose to live in a way that does not meet the physical needs of their children. For example, I had an organization who talked to me about one of their families, and this organization had very few rules and protocols. It was one of those like, we'll send you and you just go do your own thing. And they said, we have this family and we found out that they have decided that the best way to do ministry is to live like the people. And so they're not giving their children any more food than the malnourished children around them get. They won't take them to the doctor. They won't let them drink clean water, because if everyone else around them can't get that, then why should we live a more privileged life in the midst of that community? That is physical neglect, and that is not okay. So there was a very long conversation with that organization about that is not okay. That is not ever okay, and we need to act immediately. So things like that would be situations of physical neglect. I know that's more extreme, but it does happen. Emotional neglect is when children's emotional needs are not met at the time they need it most. This is really common for TCKs because they have high emotional needs at certain times when the parents are also really stressed out. But it could also be in families where the child is expected to meet another child or the parent's emotional needs. It could be a family where the child is told that their emotions aren't a big deal or don't matter. Emotional neglect is something that is really easy for TCKs to come across. And usually it's passive. So emotional neglect can be active or passive. Active is usually if there's a mental illness involved and the parent is actively neglecting the child's emotions. Doesn't usually happen or doesn't happen often with TCKs. But passive emotional neglect is just when it tends to happen because there's a lot going on. And that's something that we do see happen with a lot of TCKs. In household dysfunction, we have the mental illness of a parent. We talked about how expat parents tend to have higher rates of mental illness, so that's something to consider. That is an ACE score for the child if that's something that happened to the parent. Again, those are very directly correlated. Incarcerated relative. When I was first teaching this, I would clump incarcerated relative and mother treated violently together and say those aren't really common for TCKs, so we don't need to talk about them. Incarcerated relative, I actually have had so many people say, that was actually part of my experience, because it wasn't that they had an incarcerated relative because they were a drug user or something, but they were incarcerated for very unjust reasons. They were incarcerated because in the country, their religion was illegal, or they were incarcerated because there's a corrupt government and they wanted money out of them, or they were taken into custody for some other reason, like there's somebody taken into custody for a month because they got in a car accident, and getting in a car accident is illegal no matter whose fault it is. So incarcerated relative is something that actually happens enough to mention it for adult TCKs or for TCKs. Mother treated violently is not common for our population. Substance abuse, unfortunately, is. This is extremely common outside of the missions context, but even within it, it is something that happens. I think a lot of it is because if that was a problem before you lived in an isolated new culture, it is really easy for that to be a problem when you are in a new place and stress levels are high and there's not anybody around you to ask questions or who knew that that was a problem in the past to check on it, that sort of thing. And then divorce. Anytime parents divorce, it is an ACE score for the child because it does have very negative ramifications for children. That's something that is extremely common for expats who are not of the missions community. It looks like rates of about 70% leave wherever their post is because of marital issues. And then for missionaries, it's not nearly as common, but I think a lot of that has to do with support raising and views on whether or not that's okay and that sort of thing. So those are ACE scores and how they tend to show up for TCKs. Again, we're doing research to see what the average number is of ACE scores for TCKs. That'll be really fascinating to see. But it's important for you to hear those and know those so that we can prevent them and also know that those are boulders that we shouldn't pick up alone. So we just talked about a lot of hard things. We talked about toxic stress and ACE scores and just really difficult statistics, but there is hope. And I want you to come away from all of this realizing there is hope. But part of the reason that there is hope is because positive childhood experiences, which we'll talk about in a second, plus this preventive care can counteract these things. We can counteract those really hard things by preventing them, but also by padding them with positive childhood experiences that they have found actually counteract adverse childhood experiences. So this comes from a study that was done just in 2020, and it looked at how positive childhood experiences can decrease the rate at which ACE scores influence people. They found that these positive childhood experiences were being heard, so being able to talk openly to a family member about feelings and feel heard, accepted, and supported, believing that their family stands by them during difficult times, feeling safe and protected by an adult in the home, and feeling supported by friends, having a sense of belonging and connection with a larger group who's got your back, enjoying participating in community traditions, and feeling a sense of belonging in high school, and also having two non-parent adult relationships who take a genuine interest in them. All of these things are pieces that make up positive childhood experiences that are really, really important. And again, this is for all kids everywhere, but especially for TCKs. And one thing that I want you to think about when we look at this list is that a lot of these things will not happen for TCKs accidentally or naturally. A lot of these things need to happen very intentionally. So I would love to hear how these pieces might be difficult to maintain in the life of a TCK. And I've listed them here so you can see them all in one place. And I just want to have a short discussion on how might these be difficult to maintain.
I think TCKs, when it comes to the sense of belonging within a larger group, you're already into tricky waters there because they have a sort of a divided sense of belonging often, and they're not quite sure which group, and they feel that they're not really part of either sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, trying to find that larger group where they feel like they belong. I often hear TCKs say, well, I never belong in a group because I'm always the new person to the group. And so I don't ever have the history. That can feel like a lack of belonging.
Am I on?
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say that one about having two adult relationships outside of the parents on the mission field. My experience was that was generally impossible. I guess it depends on what your team dynamics are and what type of ministry you're involved in, and maybe if everyone's scheduled in margin. In the ministries that we were involved in, every family was trying to survive on their own and barely surviving as it was. So thinking that another adult would help with your child was wishful thinking, just because everyone was trying to barely survive on their own.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that speaks very clearly to why a lot of this needs to be addressed at an organizational level, right? Sometimes it's the organization that has the power to influence whether these things are actually a reality for the families that they send.
And going with maybe it's not the time to mention it, but yeah, with the organization, it becomes very complicated because my general experience is advising people to find third parties for any type of member care and support. Just because within an organization, that organization can decide whether you get to stay on the field or not. And so my general experience is either people lie and don't talk about their anxiety, depression, and mental health problems or team dynamics, or they're honest and there's a 50-50 shot that down the road that's going to be used against them, not purposely, but it's very hard for people in leadership to forget everything they have heard through the years when it becomes time to maybe trim some numbers back or trying to decide if someone is okay to stay on the field or not. And so it can be a dangerous thing for longevity to share and be honest with leadership about struggles. But yet it's crucial, obviously, to be open and honest with someone and with an organization. And that's the difficult thing to manage.
Yeah, I would piggyback on that just to say, I have had tons of friends in tons of different organizations and acquaintances through doing member care. And there are organizations that do that very well, even within their own structure. And there are times when they still need to talk to somebody outside. But recently I have encountered very few, but some amazing organizations who have a redemptive view of how they care for their people. So they constantly talk about how you can totally mess up. You can totally sin. You can fall completely away, and we're still going to care for you. Even when we send you home, we want you to be cared for, and we want you to come back. But that sadly is not the most common, perhaps.
As it's very, and it's nearly, it's true to a certain degree, but it's for example, if someone was, it's hard to do. It's not simply a Christian thing either. Obviously, U.S. military personnel overseas are afraid to share anything because there's no HIPAA rules over there as far as they're allowed to know every medical problem. So it's not unique, but it is it relates to those two things. Either people hide what's going on from their member care people, or it can be used against them. Now, I guess an organization could also create barriers where the member care people do not share that information with people that are in the decision making unless it becomes a danger to self or others.
Yeah.
But anyway.
Yeah.
I have to say,
Yeah, and that's, I mean, go ahead, Rosalind.
I just want to say two things really. That in UFM Worldwide, maybe it's because we have sort of 200 people in 40 countries. It's not a huge organization, but we have pastoral care for the ladies and pastoral care for the guys, and it is very open and very confidential. And I think that that's not true of all organizations, what you're saying. The other thing I would say, just want to say with this business of coming back to the sense of belonging within a large group where people are isolated, since the pandemic, we started it in the pandemic and we've kept it going. We have a monthly TCK Zoom, and we have kids from not a large group, maybe 6-10 families, and they are on every continent, and they come together, and we get somebody within our organization who has raised TCKs to do a little Bible study, and then we have games, and it has been huge in helping to connect kids who do not have a larger group around them. And I think it's one of the good things that's come out of the pandemic.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Yeah, I think for the reason that you are talking about, Brett, is so much of the reason why TCK training exists too, because yes, we want to train organizations to do these things better and inspire them to keep that in mind as they have their member care personnel working with families and that sort of thing. But also because sometimes you do need to go to a third party, and it is really helpful to feel like there's a safe third party to go to. I just serviced a family who is an embassy family, so they're not with a missions organization, but they said, we don't want to go to the government with this. Like, we don't want the government debriefing our children. We are coming to you because
it could affect what countries they get appointed to in the future as well. And they may get limited on assignments, and if they're honest.
Yeah, exactly. So anyhow, so all of these can be really difficult to maintain. That feeling that they can openly talk about difficult emotions. They might not feel they're able to do that, especially if those difficult emotions are about the work that their parents are doing. And often, whether it is ministry or foreign service or military, there is usually some sort of honorary, like higher calling to the work that they're doing. And so sometimes it feels to the children like we can't talk about those things on a difficult emotional level because we are privileged to be in this position. I have heard so many parents or so many TCKs say that they felt that their parents stood by the people they were serving more than they stood by them during difficult times. Feeling safe in their home, sometimes that is a difficult thing when they're living in a maybe high intensity context. Feeling supported by friends is difficult when your friends are constantly changing or moving or are not in the same location. Having that sense of belonging is tricky. Participating in traditions, if those constantly change or if parents are not very good at keeping anything consistent. Feeling a sense of belonging in high school to supportive adult relationships. But I hope that you can see through this that these things are difficult to maintain, but they are not impossible to do. We can encourage parents to allow their kids to talk openly. We can tell parents that their kids need to hear that they stand by them more than they stand by anyone else that they're serving, that their family comes first. We can encourage them to help them stay supported by friends, even if it's virtual. I have told so many families in the last 2 years, virtual is better than nothing. They need to feel supported by friends. And I understand that everything is locked down, but that can't go away. And so, whether it's planning that monthly Zoom meeting or weekly time where they get to talk to a friend on FaceTime or whatever it is, they need that consistently. You can't take that positive childhood experience away just because it's different and it's more complicated. Having that sense of belonging with the larger group. I would love to see more of a sense of belonging within organizations. I'm coaching some TCK caregivers who are just starting their role in their organization. And one thing I'm encouraging them to do is to get more buy in from the kids and create something that's like, I'm going to use your organization, but UFM Kids, like something like that, that's like, you are part of this. And they have swag for that. And they have a little logo and they have like things that make them feel like we're part of something. And sometimes the organization can be the one that does that. Sometimes it's a school. Sometimes the parents need to go find those groups. But knowing that that's important is really significant. That was something that when we moved out here to South Carolina during the pandemic, we looked for a church. And for a while, we were just doing it online. And after a while, said, our kids need to find that larger group that they belong in. I know this is important because I do this for my job. I know this is important that they need that larger group, and church is an excellent place to find that. So let's not try to find the best church and just attend online. Let's look at whichever ones have child care services available. And so we went by default because it was the only one in the city that had the nursery open or the children's programs open, and went there and got our kids involved. And it was because I know they need that larger group who's got their back. And you know what? We got messages every week that we weren't there from the teachers in the class saying, hey, we missed Clara today, or we missed Audrey today. And that just speaks to that, right? Like, that is why that is important. Participating in traditions, helping families to know the importance of positive anticipation, things kids can look forward to because they know that something's coming that they can expect and they're excited about. That could be game night on Fridays. It could be that they do something special for Christmas every year, whatever it is, but making sure families know that that is important. That sense of belonging in high school. I'm really careful about how I coach families when they have high schoolers and they're considering different moves and possibilities for that. They need a sense of belonging in high school. I went to a different high school every year. I went to a different school every year from 7th grade through high school, and a different type of school. So I did international school and charter school and public school and homeschool. I did all the things. So I think God did that so I can speak to all of them and be like, oh yeah, I did that one too. But it was really difficult because I never felt a sense of belonging in high school. And so helping parents to see that is important. Yes, your kids are resilient. Also, this is important. So let's think about how we can do this in a way that gives them these pieces. And then to supportive adult relationships. How can we find those? How can we make those accessible? It can be virtual. It could be a virtual family member, somebody though who comes alongside them. I was talking to a family and we were talking about this, and she said that her mother, the mom's mother, so it would have been the grandmother of the children, does a virtual coffee date with her 16-year-old daughter once a week. And it's like a Friday morning or something. And they just talk every Friday morning. They both sit at the screen with their cup of coffee. And I thought, how wonderful is that? That is a supportive adult relationship who is showing up for coffee with a 16-year-old granddaughter every week. So it's possible, it can happen. But my point is, it doesn't happen unintentionally. A lot of these things for our TCKs need to happen with a lot of intentionality. The other rule about this, that I just want to make sure we clarify is that it is most of these things most of the time. It is not all of these things all of the time, otherwise it doesn't work. It's most of these things most of the time. That is what contributes to that buffering of those difficult childhood experiences. And the whole point here is that going through hard things without these pieces present increases fragility. If you are going through hard things without friends, without supportive relationships, without things to look forward to, without all of those pieces, that is going to continually tear the TCK down. That means that every difficult thing that comes just knocks them farther down. That is harmful. That's what we're preventing. Going through hard things in itself, though, is not bad. And with those pieces present, it actually is resilience building. So again, we're not trying to take away the hard things. We're just saying they need to be buffered by positive things because that's what builds resilience. There is a myth that children are naturally resilient, and that is not true. Resiliency is built intentionally. It does not happen without intention. I'm going to keep going because we're going to run out of time if I don't. So we're going to talk about some of the challenges and opportunities that we see for TCKs. And there are more than the 5 or 6 of these that we're going to talk about. And they're in the book, Raising Up a Generation of Healthy TCKs. But these are the ones that I want to kind of camp on today, because I think these are the most prominent and are the most significant when we provide preventive care. So the first is emotional health. And the way that I have all of these laid out, as you can see on this page, is what does it look like when we don't do this well, but what is the benefit when we do? Because I want you to hear that, again, we can't have those awesome benefits without the challenge. But when we don't take care of the challenge, it's not just static. It goes in a bad direction and doesn't go towards something that is healthy. When TCKs routinely have their emotional needs unmet, that leads to a lack of emotional health. That leads to not being able to care well for your own emotions, for the emotions of others, not being in tune and self-aware. I don't know how many of you have experienced people who are very unself-aware, but that can be one of the most difficult things to try to navigate, right? People who just don't understand themselves, they're not self-aware. It is really hard to work with those people, whether it's in a friendship or a family member or a relationship. That's not what we want for TCKs. But when they have emotional health education and practice, which they have lots of opportunity to practice, right? They can have a really high emotional intelligence. They can be really good at knowing these are my healthy coping skills and my unhealthy coping skills, and I know how to tell the difference and how to use the healthy ones. They can know, I know how to express my emotions and talk about them well and in depth and process them. I know how to accurately depict the things that are going on emotionally. And that leads to that high emotional intelligence. I believe that if there was nothing else that we needed to talk about, it would be this: setting an emotional foundation, because it is critical. We cannot process grief without talking about emotions. We cannot talk about identity without talking about emotions. This is the foundational layer. And so this is the thing that if I only told parents one thing, it would be this emotions piece. They experience an intense amount of grief and loss, and without vocabulary to talk about it and express what they're feeling, that's what keeps it unresolved. That's what leads to depression and anxiety. That's what causes problems. They need vocabulary to express what they're feeling and what's going on. I don't know if you've ever been in a situation. I know I have many times. I have great friends who do this a lot, where you're trying to talk about why something was so hard and it wasn't going well, and you just didn't have the words. And they say, it sounds like you were feeling really discouraged. And you're like, yes, that's exactly what I'm feeling. And it just kind of releases it. It's like, oh, okay, now that I have language, I feel a little bit better and I feel a little bit more in control and I am able to process better what's gone on. Kids need that. And they need that, especially if they're TCKs, because of the amount of stuff that they go through, that they deal with and struggle with. They also need permission to feel a full range of emotions. I worked with a group of about 15 adult MKs, missionary kids, over the summer. And it was one of the best experiences of my life. It was one of those moments where I was like, this is what I was made for. But I got to talk to this group of adult TCKs, and they were about to go work with other TCKs who were younger in a different country. And so I was training these TCKs to go work with other TCKs, and they brought me in to talk about how they needed to process and work on themselves to be a healthy adult TCK so that they could serve in the best capacity possible for these younger TCKs. Amazing program. And whoever thought of that and contacted me was brilliant. But we sat around and I said, okay, I want you to show me with your hands, and we'll use our hands as a scale, the range of emotions that you felt you were allowed to feel throughout your life. The average was about this big. And then we talked about, okay, so what would happen if you went either direction? And they said, well, we just knew it wasn't okay because supporters wouldn't be okay with it, or it would be detrimental to the ministry or the work, or we weren't staying in line. And the really fascinating thing was I said, okay, so is that true on both sides, on positive emotions and on difficult emotions? And they said, oh, yeah, because we could never get too excited about anything because we were always told, well, you don't know if that's going to happen, or don't get too excited because we don't really know who's going to be here for Christmas, or we don't really know if grandma and grandpa are actually going to be able to come. So don't look forward to that too much. So don't get too excited about it. And on the other side, it was, you can be a little bit sad, but you need to always remember that there's a bigger purpose. And you need to always remember that there are good things, and we need to focus on the positive and that sort of thing. When you are living a life where you have friends who move away a lot, when you're changing schools, when you're changing continents and countries and lives, and you are losing significant pieces of yourself, that warrants some bigger emotions. That warrants being able to feel a bit more emotion. One thing that I talk about with parents, and I have a slide on a parent presentation somewhere that says this, but boundaries are for behaviors, not for emotions. We're not saying you can express a full range of emotions any way you want to express them, but we are saying that they should feel like they are allowed to feel them. It is okay for you to feel devastated because your friend moved away and you don't know if you'll ever see them again. That emotion is not too big for that. That is not too extreme. That is a real emotion for that situation, and that's okay to feel. We need to give them permission. Emotions work is also critical for any processing to take place. Processing, as we talked about a minute ago, and as Brett was talking about too, it requires using the emotional side of your brain. TCKs are often taught that they need to stay on the logical side of their brain. They need to always bring logic into the situation, and that should discount the feelings that they're feeling. If you can come up with good reasons for it, you shouldn't have the feelings for it. And so they don't go to the emotional side of their brain. What we know about grief processing and about even trauma processing, there's a great thing called EMDR, which is a therapy for processing trauma. You have to access the emotional side of your brain in order to release those triggers. You can't do it by yelling from the logical side of your brain, hey, it's all okay, it all worked out, we don't need to worry about that anymore. That doesn't work. We have to get into the emotional side. And what I find with TCKs is that they're often so far on the logical side because that's what got them the accolades. That's what got them the praise is, oh, look how optimistic you are. And look at you're putting a smile on your face, even though this is so hard. Good job. I'm really proud of you. They need to have this emotional side in order for processing to take place. And then finally, emotionally safe spaces are critical for connection for both parents and children. They need to be emotionally safe spaces. That means that they're affirming, acknowledging, and comforting. Affirming is when we say, that makes sense. That emotion is real and valid for that situation. It is okay to feel that. It's okay to be angry right now. That makes sense for this situation. To acknowledge that they brought it to you and you are glad that they did. This is for a caregiver, for a parent. Thank you so much for sharing that with me. I am so glad that you told that to me. I don't know if you've ever been in a situation, I know I have, where you share something that feels really vulnerable and then you leave the conversation wondering, I don't know how that was perceived. I don't know if I should have shared that. Did I go too deep? Maybe that wasn't a good idea. Kids feel that too, and teenagers. And so it's important when you can tell they're opening up to you to, again, affirm, but also say, thank you for sharing that with me. I want to hear those things. And then comfort in whatever way they feel comforted. I was just debriefing a family, and they had the sweetest 11-year-old boy, and he was writing out his grief tower, which it was hard. It was hard for me, and he was writing it out. He was having a really hard time. I affirmed, I acknowledged, and then I said, "Do you want a hug?" He was like, yeah. And so he came and gave me the biggest hug and just started sobbing. And I just hugged him. And he was this like 11-year-old boy who's trying to be really macho and strong. And I just kept saying, it's okay to cry. There is a lot to cry about. There is a lot. It is perfectly okay. Like this is great. So comfort. And then tell me more. I could also title this Be Curious. Try to explain and ask questions that encourage them to tell you more, saying, can you tell me more about that? Or I've never gone through something like that. What was that like? I've never had that experience. Can you tell me what that was like for you? But trying to bring out them in conversation more. We want to avoid the shutdown responses, and these are downplaying, defending, competing, and correcting. 2 Ds and 2 Cs. Downplaying is when we make it seem like the grief isn't that big of a deal. We make it seem like in the grand scheme of things, it's not really that significant. Defending is when we defend the decision that caused the grief. This happens so much in our line of work, whether it's missions or military or whatever. The idea is if the reason is good enough, then the grief doesn't matter, right? If we have a good reason, like God called us to this place, then we also shouldn't be sad about it. Those two things do not go together. Defending the decision that caused the grief does not help to process it. It shuts it down. So we need to be really careful about that. There can be a good decision and there can still be difficult emotions that go along with it. Competing is when we are competing our grief to theirs or one grief to another. So if a parent says, well, you thought it was bad for you, think of all that I had to do in those 24 hours of trying to pack and evacuate, right? It could be saying, well, compared to this, that one's not that big of a deal. I hear that a lot when we're working on creating kids' grief towers, and they'll say, well, I don't know if I should put that one on there because it's not as bad as this one. It still goes on there. It still needs to be processed. We never compare blocks. They need to be on there no matter what, even if it doesn't seem like it's as big as something else. And then correcting. This is when we're correcting the facts when they're telling us their feelings. When they are expressing something that is why they're feeling the way they felt, and we say, oh, I thought you actually lived over there and not over here. Or that was only 2 weeks, not 2 months. Or that's not actually how it happened. This is how it happened. It doesn't matter in that moment because it's their perspective that needs to be processed, not the reality. The reality is not what's stuck in their brain, it's their perspective. And so we need to make sure that we are using those safe space responses to hear their perspective, to comfort them, to acknowledge them, to be curious. And then there is time to go back at another time after you've had that conversation to narrate the truth, to talk about the reasons why, to talk about your perspective, whatever it is. There's time after that, but never in the moment. Emotional needs for kids go unmet when we assume children are resilient. This is one of those pet peeve myths of mine. I actually have a funny story. I was calling around looking for preschools for my youngest, and this was at the beginning of the pandemic. And I was talking to one director of preschool, and she was telling me all of their COVID protocols that include like hazard masks and suits for the teachers, and that they were meeting the kids in the parking lot, and the parents weren't allowed to come in the building, and the kids had to have masks and gloves on, and they had all these protocols. And I said, wow, that sounds extreme. That sounds like a lot. She said, yeah, but kids are resilient. They won't even remember it in a couple of years. I had to take a deep breath and answer kindly, but I wanted to be like, I teach on this, and that is not true. So assuming children are resilient, what we're essentially saying when we say children are resilient is that we are excusing the lack of intentional care. When we say children are resilient, we're saying they're not worthy of intentional care because they'll be okay anyway. That's not true. We know they need intentional care. Emotional needs also go unmet, like we talked about, when there's high stress correlated with high need. When their emotional needs are high and the stress levels because of the situation, environment, whatever's going on are high. Sometimes it's a generational lack of emotional health. I've worked with many families where it's clear that the parents don't have a good handle on emotional health. And so sometimes, most often, that's because their parents didn't. And so now it's being passed to these TCKs, and they're living this TCK life with parents who are not emotionally healthy themselves. Then they don't model emotional health. When children don't have good models, it's really difficult for them to learn what to do, particularly when they're in this TCK life of blocks being stacked on their grief tower. If their parents also have those blocks stacking up, which often they do, there's often consistent correlation there, then they're not getting good models from their parents on how we deal with this. Sometimes they go unmet because people are uncomfortable with negative emotions. These could be parents, these could be caregivers. It is tempting to hear difficult things and want to turn it around quickly and look for the positive and say, let's go play a game, let's do something fun. Hearing difficult emotions is uncomfortable. But it is okay that it's uncomfortable. Uncomfortable does not mean we need to get out of it. It means it's okay to sit in it. And sometimes that's all they need, is to have somebody sit with them in those difficult things. I saw this picture one time. It was a meme, if you know what that is, but it was this picture of a person in a ditch. So they were sitting in the bottom of the ditch, and it was a what to do and what not to do. And the what not to do was there's another stick figure at the top of the ditch yelling down and saying statements like, God is good, tomorrow's a new day, it'll be okay, and saying all of these like, let's lift you up things. And then the next picture was somebody climbing down into the ditch and sitting there and saying, this is hard, isn't it? That's what we're talking about, is being that person that climbs down and says, this is hard, isn't it? It's okay that this feels so hard. You've been through a lot. Instead of being that person at the top that's just yelling positive things to try to pull them out. And then finally, assuming the parents will do it. Those of you who are parents, I hope you will. I hope that you will take meeting your kids' emotional needs seriously and teaching them about emotions, that you'll take that seriously. But those of us who are caregivers, we can't assume that we don't need to talk about this. I had an organization that I was training once, and somebody raised their hand and said, well, isn't this all the parents' job? Yes, and if they're not doing it and your job is to advocate for TCKs, that becomes your job. And parents need support. Sometimes the kids, especially teenagers, might hear it better from somebody who's a caregiver than they will from their mom. And that's okay. That is normal. But we can't just assume that parents are going to do it or that that's the best option. And so we need to also make sure that we are helping with this education and care. So addressing this, we need to prioritize an emotional education for TCKs and parents, give parents practical tools for meeting emotional needs, model during your time with TCKs, whether you're a parent or you're a caregiver. That means using emotions words. That means showing that you feel different emotions. And then be a safe space for emotional expression. We're doing a workshop in 2022 on laying an emotional foundation for TCKs. And we're basically taking this page and making this the outline for the workshop. So what do all these things look like? What activities, what things can we put into each of these bullet points that will give a lot more information on how we actually do this? Because of course, that's a whole workshop in and of itself. And this is a 3-hour workshop on lots of things. So our next topic is grief and loss. When grief goes unresolved and losses stay hidden, they stack up. They get taller and taller and taller, and that's where our tower analogy comes in, is that they keep getting taller. And it is a myth that the tower goes away when you turn 18 and you get to start from scratch. I have had lots of people say something that alludes to the fact that that's what happens. That's not what happens. You start adulthood with whatever tower's there and it just adds on to whatever's there. And if that happens, we see a toppling grief tower. This happens most often between ages 18 and 24, and it leads to something called CPTSD, or complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And we'll talk about that in just a second. But when they have processed their grief and loss, they become the most empathetic people because they've experienced it and they know how to be a safe space. People who have experienced grief and loss and have had somebody be a safe space for them are often the best at being a safe space for someone else. And because we know the majority of TCKs end up working in a helping profession, that's a really great skill. That's something that is a really helpful thing for them to be able to provide. So what happens with unresolved grief is the tower builds during the developmental years. The reason the developmental years are important is because it's during the developmental years that they are developing their coping skills. You learn what works and what doesn't. If you learn that eating a lot of candy makes you feel a little bit better, you're probably going to eat a lot of candy the next time something hard happens. You're developing those skills. You're determining how relationships work. A lot of TCK's grief tower blocks involve relationship. That is impactful. When all of your blocks involving relationship during your developmental years tell the narrative that people will abandon you, that is something that's really hard to undo. The tower during the developmental years influences how you think the world works. They influence how you start to have your thought processes, things that you start to think or believe about the world and about yourself and about people. And eventually, if that tower isn't unstacked, it will topple over. Again, it's usually in the early 20s years. This is often because you have a tall tower going into adulthood and now you're on your own and there's stressful things that happen. And then it's just enough to knock the tower over and that causes a trauma response. You've probably heard of regular PTSD. CPTSD is basically that instead of one big T trauma, like regular PTSD, it's a bunch of little T traumas, which are grief-inducing experiences that add up over time. And it causes the same symptoms as PTSD, but there's not one big T trauma source. There's a bunch of little things that stacked up, like the grief tower. Some ways that we see this show up are habit formation. These are usually anxious or nervous habits like chewing nails for the first time, pulling out hair, picking skin, doing things that are destructive. It could even be self-harm. Hair loss is a common one for some reason, that they tend to lose hair. Stomach issues is very common. IBS, having a lot of stomach issues. Our gut reacts to stress, and this CPTSD usually influences your gut. Nightmares are common, a sudden onset of anxiety, autoimmune disease, even fibromyalgia is a common one, unexplained rashes or itching, other mental health disorders. It could be a number of things, but the one thing that I tell parents and caregivers to keep an eye out for is if they're in that age range and they have what you might say is a lot of unprocessed grief, a tall grief tower, and they say something like, I have never experienced this before, and all of the sudden, dot, dot, dot. All of the sudden, I am experiencing depression, and I thought people were crazy when they were depressed, and I have never felt like this before, and now I get it. Or all of a sudden, I was having all these stomach issues, or all of a sudden, I have all of this pain. We never want to say, and we make this very clear in all our material, we never want to say, don't go to a doctor, right? Go to a doctor, get it figured out. But we do want to say it is not uncommon for there to be an underlying cause. And it is common for TCKs to have this toppled grief tower, this CPTSD, because of a lot of the grief that they've carried around with them. And the only option for dealing with a tall grief tower is either to process it and to unstack it, or to continue coping with it in unhealthy ways. And the thing about coping, and I talk to teenagers about this a lot, the thing about coping is your skills have to get stronger. If you use numbing as a way to cope when you are a teenager and you numb through video games and binge watching TV, numbing is probably going to be your go-to as you continue to get older. And maybe numbing turns into finding substances that also help you numb, and finding other things that help you numb, and bad relationships. They tend to consistently choose the same coping skill, but that coping skill tends to change and get stronger within that category. That could be distraction, that could be isolation, that could be numbing, like I talked about, lots of different things. And those skills have to get stronger in order to handle that tall grief tower. The things that stack on the tower are any losses. That could be friends moving away. That is any move. And move is always a loss, no matter whether it was a mostly good experience or not. There are always losses with a move. Any move, changing schools, a pet dying, losses. Family crises, those impact everyone in the family. This is true even if the details were kept from the kids, and I have to explain that to parents a lot. Yes, they may not have known what was going on, but do you think that maybe you were a little bit more tense when that was going on? Do you think that maybe the house didn't quite feel as peaceful when that was going on? And they usually say, oh yeah, it was awful for my husband and I, but we just didn't tell the kids what was going on. Yes. So they probably felt it, even if they didn't know the details. And that feeling is a block on their grief tower. So family crises, they impact the whole family. Intense moments of fear. This is if there's fear because of something environmental, like a natural disaster, a political coup, COVID, if that brought on intense fear. It could also be fear out of concern. So you are very concerned for someone's safety, or you're concerned because somebody has passed away. It could be fear that is explicit fear, and that is an extreme example, like being held at gunpoint. That would be an explicit fear. You are explicitly afraid yourself. Seasons of anxiety or depression. If there was a really difficult season and it isn't a block of its own on the grief tower, that would be a block. And then any grief-inducing experiences. And when I work with TCKs, I have them make their own emotions chart and put down 12 emotions out of a big long list that I have. 12 emotions that they say they've experienced the most throughout their life. And when we look at the blocks on their tower, I go through any of the difficult emotions they've put on their chart and say, is there anything else that made you feel dot, dot, dot. For example, if they had terrified on there, is there anything else that has made you feel terrified that we haven't already put on your tower? Is there anything that's made you feel weary that we haven't already put on your tower? If you say that you felt that a lot, let's talk about what those situations were that made you feel that, because that probably goes on your tower. There is no harm in putting something on the tower. So whenever I'm working with families, and if you're working with your kids or another family, there's no harm in putting something on the tower and processing it, because if it is put on the tower, there's probably a reason. If they say, can I put that on there? Absolutely. These are often overlooked because sometimes acknowledging the hard feels like betraying the good. That's why I like to use the ampersand analogy. And you can maybe see in my background, I have a little ampersand back there. I like to talk about that there's good and hard. And sometimes we have to talk about the hard side, but that doesn't mean the good side goes away. And I do this little object lesson where I fold the paper in half and I say, it doesn't mean that the good side is ripped off. It does mean, though, that sometimes we have to be on the hard side and we have to talk about the hard side. Sometimes they've been shut down in the past. I've heard more than once, well, my mom said that wasn't that big of a deal. Did you think it was that big of a deal? That would go on there. If they've been shut down in the past, they might overlook it. Sometimes it's because these events are normal in the TCK life. If everyone's best friend moves away and they don't ever see them again, is it really that big of a deal? Yes, it is absolutely a big deal, even if it is normal in everyone's life. I had one teenage TCK say, well, I mean, that one evacuation was really hard, but don't most families who you work with get evacuated? Yes, and that doesn't mean it's not a big deal, right? It got better. These are the overpositive people who use positivity sometimes as a coping skill. We're not going to talk about it because it got better. We have moved on. It's not a big deal now. Well, if it wasn't processed, then we do need to process it, even if now we know what happened in the end. And then sometimes block comparisons are why they're overlooked. When we say, well, compared to this block, that one's not that big of a deal. We need to prevent a tall grief tower. So this workshop is all about preventive care. I teach debriefing certification trainings that are all about preventive care through a debrief, but that's a lot of how do we look at the grief tower, unstack the grief tower, move forward in healthier ways. But what I want to talk to you all about is how do we prevent it from growing? You are living with, working with TCKs. How do we prevent the tower from growing? One, we need to model grief processing. Kids need to know what it looks like to process their grief. And often, if you think about it, you probably have great skills for grief processing. Maybe you are one who likes to journal. Maybe you exercise. Maybe you like to go for walks. Maybe you pray about it. What do you do? And do your kids or the kids that you work with know that you do that? Because they will have no idea what you're writing in your journal or what you're praying about or why you're going for more walks unless you tell them and explain that when things are really hard, this is a way that helps you to process through that grief. We need to accurately depict the hard. And that means that when things are really hard, we allow them to be really hard. And we say that they're really hard. And we use words like terrifying or devastating or discouraging or disappointing. We say that it's really hard because that gives them permission to feel like it's really hard. When we use words like, for example, if we say, it's a bummer that we don't get to have ice cream after dinner, isn't it? And then we say, it's a bummer that your best friend moved away and we don't ever get to see them again, isn't it? What we're saying when we do that is that you should feel the same thing about both those situations because we're using the same word and it should feel the same. We need to make sure that we are accurately depicting the hard for TCKs and saying, it's a bummer you didn't get ice cream after dinner. It is devastating that your friend moved away. That must feel crushing. That must feel really discouraging. and help them to talk through it and realize that it is okay to have that extreme emotion over something that is really hard. Respond well to grief. That has to do with not shutting down those, using those shutdown responses, not downplaying it, not defending it, not competing with it or correcting it, but responding well. Process after diffusing. Diffusing is when there is an expression of grief that is usually poor behavior or an emotional outburst or developmental reverting, something going on. And we diffuse to get them to calm down, or we discipline for the poor behavior or whatever we're doing to diffuse. But sometimes we never go deeper into processing and we just stick with diffusing. It is entirely possible for a TCK to go their whole life only being diffused and never having anyone help them process. When we diffuse, we're getting them out of that red zone, but we're never talking about why they got there or how they got there or what they were doing to cope with it when they were in there. We need to help them to process, not just diffuse. We need to not minimize blocks. All blocks are important and worth being processed. And then we need to debrief regularly. We suggest at TCK training that debriefs happen every 2 to 4 years, depending on what happened in those years. 2 years if it's been a lot, which all of you who have been through the COVID season over the last 2 years probably need a debrief. There's been a lot that's gone on. If there's not a lot that's gone on, 4 years is fine, but debriefing regularly provides an intentional time and space to go into the hard. And sometimes you need to set aside a time and space to do that has a beginning and an end, because that gives the permission to go into the hard, knowing that you get to come out from underwater after 3 days or however long it is that you do your debrief. All right, identity. When TCKs have an unanchored identity, and we'll talk about what that means, that leads to something called terminal uniqueness, which is the idea that I am so different from everyone else. I'm so unique that nobody could possibly know me, love me, and understand me. If you believe that, that leads really quickly to isolation. I'm just not even going to try because nobody can know me, love me, and understand me anyway. It leads to loneliness, to depression, and even to suicide. When we address the identity challenges, though, we get the TCKs who have this beautifully complex identity that it draws people in. It is really, really amazing and wonderful, but they have to have some anchors. Identity is a challenge because there are so many contributors to it. They have their family identity, which may be just one identity, but maybe their parents come from different cultures. So then there's more than one even in their house. Their TCK identity, which we at TCK training always say that is a piece, not the whole. It is a piece of who they are. It is never the most important, biggest piece of who they are. They have their national identity, the host culture or cultures if they live in multiple, the school identity. Maybe their best friend has a different nationality, and so they have that identity. There's so many contributors. Another factor is that identity and belonging are so intertwined. When we don't feel like people can understand us, it's going to be difficult to feel like we belong. That belonging within a larger group, belonging with friends, those positive childhood experiences are difficult to have when identity is such a struggle. And then finally, identity is developed differently than the parent's identity, and that makes it sometimes difficult for parents to understand what is going on with their TCK. So this is my little analogy for what happens with TCK identity. For the parent, assuming the parent grew up in their passport culture, we're assuming they are a monocultural parent. Their roots grown in their passport culture are the longest because they grew during their developmental years, and the roots grown during the developmental years are always the longest and the strongest. So their roots grew in the passport culture. They moved to a new culture, and that absolutely adds roots. I always have parents say, well, I was impacted too by living in this new culture. Yes, you were. but they're always going to be shorter than the passport culture roots. The roots are the values, the ideas, the beliefs, the ways that you think the world works, the rules and expectations of society. Those are always going to be the longest and the strongest in their passport culture. And the new roots will be there, but they won't be as significant. For the TCK, though, the roots grown in the host cultures are the longest. Their values, beliefs, ideas, worldview, rules, expectations, those are all the longest in the passport culture because that's the soil they're in. Yes, they do have roots, though, from their passport country, and that happens and is formed because of their parents' influence. They're living in their parents' house. They're still going to get those rules, expectations, beliefs, values from their parents. They might get it from visits. They might eventually relocate, but it looks very different. And that's why the TCK identity is different from their parents' identity, is different from even somebody who migrates to a different country. The difference is in the root systems and how they are developed. So, what we talk about with identity is that TCKs need to have an anchored identity. And the idea there is that there are some things that do not change no matter who you're with and where in the world you are. Those are the anchors. What can happen is that they can have an ever adapting identity. And that means that there are no anchors. Their whole identity adapts to the people, the place, the language they're speaking. There is nothing that stays anchored. Adapting is fine. Adapting everything is unhealthy. They also sometimes have a fear of losing their TCK identity. This is why we keep the TCK identity a piece. Because if you say being a TCK is the best thing about you and the entire part of who you are, well, what happens when you've lived back in your passport country for 10 years? What happens when you don't have a lot of friends who are TCKs? What happens if you don't give your kids that TCK life? If there's this fear of losing the TCK identity, we see a lot of adult TCKs do things that are unhealthy in order to maintain that identity. And they'll say things like, well, I will never buy a house in my passport country. TCKs don't do that. Or I could never be friends with someone who's not a TCK. TCKs don't do that. Sometimes they feel like they're not enough of any identity. I can speak Swahili on the phone and convince somebody that I am Tanzanian. But I will never be able to walk down the street in Tanzania and have somebody think I'm Tanzanian. I do not look the part. No matter how well I can speak the language like a local, I will never be enough of that identity. Likewise, in America, I don't get half the jokes, and there are references to pop culture and TV shows that happened while we were living in Africa that I totally missed. And so I will never feel like I'm completely enough of that identity either. Again, terminal uniqueness, that idea that they're so unique that nobody could possibly know, love, and understand them. Relational challenges come, and then searching for belonging in the wrong places. This is something that can be controversial, but there are places to find belonging and groups who want to provide belonging to TCKs that are fringe groups of society. And fringe groups of society can look different depending on the culture, depending on the place, depending on what those fringe groups are doing or believing in. But they usually are really welcoming of TCKs who are willing to adapt all of their identity in order to fit in. And so they tend to search for belonging in those fringe groups and not have that anchor that stays the same when they're in those groups. And so they tend to over adapt everything about them in order to find belonging in those groups. So we want to make sure that we help to establish positive identities, remembering that they have lots of pieces and that all the pieces belong there and are beautiful. We want to educate parents, so you all who are parents and caregivers, to praise the complex identity. We want them to know that that is a good thing. It is okay that they are complex. And we also want to not let relationship be impacted by lack of passport country patriotism. Your roots grew differently than theirs, and that is okay. By taking your children to live in a different country, you chose to have their roots grow in different soil, and that is not a bad thing, but it does mean they may not feel super patriotic toward their passport country. And that can't be something that impacts relationship negatively. And then finally, we need to teach about the identity anchor. The idea of the identity anchor is that there are things that don't change no matter who you're with and where in the world you are. The great thing about this identity anchor concept is that it helps to differentiate adaptable traits from core traits. What are the things you can adapt? I have this conversation all the time with teenagers, and I have a great worksheet on what to chameleon and what not to chameleon. You can adapt clothing, the way that you talk, the way that you even use your body language. You can adapt those things. That's great, and that's an awesome skill. But there have to be core traits, beliefs, values, ideas, the things you think are important, the character traits that you have. Those things should not change for the people that you're with. Identity anchors can also aid in relationship building because you can look for people who have similar identity anchors, and those don't have to be other TCKs. That is something that I love to talk to TCKs about who are transitioning to a new place. Don't worry about finding other TCKs. Worry about finding people who have similar identity anchors. What are the things on yours? That could be the fact that you love music. Great, go find someone else who loves music. It should include some character traits. It should include some values. Because of that, it also can bring a sense of belonging and steadfastness. If you find people who share identity anchors, you are all going to be way more steadfast in keeping your identity anchors intact if you all have similar ones. This is why things like youth group are great, or things like even getting involved in drama or things like that, where you have this group that you belong in, and if you all have similar values, that is helpful. And then it can also encourage identity in Christ for those of you who are from the missions context. I know not all are, and that's perfectly fine. But for those of you who are, I think this is another important thing to consider of what are those things that belong on the identity anchor that God says we are. And I love this quote, fitting in is about assessing a situation and becoming who you need to be accepted. Belonging, on the other hand, doesn't require us to change who we are. It requires us to be who we are. TCKs need help figuring out who they are before they transition and are trying to fit in, because they're not going to feel that belonging if their identity anchor changes every time they move, every time they go to a new group. They will never feel that sense of belonging that kids need, that teenagers need, unless they know what their identity anchors are. Our next topic is the need for change, and I will make sure we have time for questions at the end, just so you know. When TCKs are controlled by their need for change, they have addictive change making. They make lots of big changes addictively. They do it all the time. And that creates unhealthy relationships and patterns. It is difficult to maintain healthy relationships when you are constantly being controlled by the need for change. And it's easy to develop patterns when that alarm clock is going off. Maybe that pattern is that you move every year. Maybe that pattern is a job change every 6 months. Maybe that pattern is a romantic relationship change every 6 months. It comes out somehow. But when they have controlled their need for change, they're in control of it, that's what leads to healthy adaptability. TCKs are great at adapting, but they can't be controlled by their need for change. They have to be in control of it in order for that adapting to be healthy. So, understanding the need for change. It is instilled in highly mobile environments. That means that either they are moving a lot or the people around them are coming and going a lot. That system is put into place, and that's one of those routes that gets developed, and it creates this alarm clock that says, ooh, it's fun when things are new and different and things get changed and I have new people or a new place or a new environment. It is intensified if they are not involved in major life decisions, because they don't then see the process of a big change being made. They see that we can decide on a whim that we're moving to a different continent, and that's perfectly reasonable. They didn't see all of the hours of conversations and thoughts and pros and cons lists and prayer and whatever else went into that decision. They just saw that it was made very quickly, even if it wasn't. It's one that manifests in adulthood. It is one that we often don't see as an issue until adulthood. So this is one of those, like, we're very much using preventive care because it's not something that we see now, but we see it a lot in adult TCKs. And it seems innocuous. It seems like maybe this isn't that big of a deal. The reality, though, is that this is really destructive for a lot of adult TCKs. And I see a lot of divorce happen because of this. I see a lot of lack of ability to keep a job because of this. I see really unhealthy moving, like moving too consistently to have good relationships anywhere because of this. So we do need to take it seriously. Like I said, it can result in detached relationships. Why get close to people if I know that I'm gonna be on the move soon? It can have harmful career ramifications. It's difficult to get a job if you have on your resume that you change jobs every 6 months. They can be subconsciously controlled by the need for change, which means that they don't understand why they're doing it. They don't understand why they have a new relationship every year. I had a TCK who I pointed out after they were engaged for the 3rd January in a row that they had a new relationship every January. And they said, really? And I said, yeah, think about it. They didn't realize that every year on the dot, they were deep into another relationship. It was very subconscious. This is often also because they usually find really great reasons. It is amazing the depth of reasoning that can seem like it's come, can seem like this decision has come from. And so they'll talk about, well, I needed to change universities again, even though this is the 3rd one. I needed to change universities again because this one, I thought that I wanted to do this major, but I don't really want to do this major. And this other major that I think I want to do, it's only at this school over in this state. And so they'll change schools and states again to do that major. And you might think, oh, well, I mean, I guess that makes sense that you would need to do that. But then you start asking, well, what happened the other 3 times? And there's always a good reason. Well, I didn't love the teacher there, or the style wasn't really great, or I didn't really like the location. And so they make these changes subconsciously. They also sometimes get to the point of conceding to this alarm clock despite the consequences. And that's when it's really harmful. When their spouse says, we have moved every 2 years our entire marriage, and now it's been 15 years and I can't do it anymore. And they say, I don't know how to stop. I don't know how to not do that. And they do it despite the consequences. That could be for their family. If they know it's not good for their kids, but they keep doing it because they don't know how to not do it. If it's not good for their career or their mental, emotional, or physical health, but they keep doing it anyway. So what we need to do is encourage parents, and I encourage you who are parents, to invite your kids in on the decision to move abroad the first time and any other time. They need to know what that decision looks like. It may be that you don't invite them on the decision until you have a final answer, and that's okay. Reenact it. You're not being untruthful, but just reenact what happened, right? So let's make a pros and cons list. Let's pray about it. Let's talk to somebody about it. They need to see, though, the process of a big decision being made. We want parents to teach their kids about decision making, the difference between big and small changes. Big changes need to be thought through with care. Those involve location, relationship. Small changes can be made when you need a change in your life. I was teaching college age TCKs a few years ago, and we were talking about this, and I was joking and said something like, I think temporary hair dye is made for TCKs because then you could make small changes whenever you want and it goes away and it's not impactful. And they all started laughing so hard and looking at each other. And I kind of looked at them, and they said that they had a not a sleepover, but they all live in dorms. They were hanging out one night and they all dyed their hair with temporary hair dye. And this was like a few nights earlier. So it was one of those funny moments. But small changes. You can rearrange the furniture instead of moving countries. You can paint the wall. You can dye your hair. You can go a different route to your work. Whatever it is to make small changes to satisfy that need for change in healthy ways. And then we want to teach the process of making a big change. It should always include brainstorming, and these spell out big. Brainstorming. Write a pros and cons list. Think of all of the reasons why this is a good idea and what would happen if you didn't do it. Include others, preferably who are not also TCKs, because the TCKs will say, yeah, move to Iceland. That's a great idea. Do you need a ride to the airport tomorrow? We want to include others who are going to give sound advice and not the TCK advice. And then gratitude. It is often that when we're wanting to make these big decisions and we're being controlled by that need for change, that we find all the things wrong with the situation or the person or the job or whatever it is. And so it's really important to take the time to think about the things that are good about it. So parents, caregivers, it would be helpful for you to walk through those, brainstorm, include others, and gratitude anytime there's a big change to be made. If you're considering when to take a home assignment, if you're considering when to move abroad, if you're considering whether to switch communities that you're working with or switch churches or whatever it is, if you're in the process of making a big change, brainstorm, include others, and find things to be grateful for and include your kids in on that. And then finally, subconscious expectations. This is our last one, and we'll have time for questions. Subconscious expectations are the things that we thought were going to happen a certain way that then didn't, but we don't necessarily think about them cognitively. We just kind of expect it to happen. And when those things don't go the way that we want them to, that leads to disappointment, discouragement, and even depression. But TCKs can be some of the most content people because it's almost like, you know, that phrase, the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence. It's almost like they've seen lots of different sides of lots of different fences, and they know that there's good and hard about any of them. I know, having moved to South Carolina, there's good and hard about South Carolina, just like there would be if we moved back to Oregon, where we came from. I didn't have this grandiose idea that it was going to be perfect or that it was going to be terrible. I know there's good and hard wherever you are. And that leads to a contentment. I met with a counselor for adult TCKs. His name is Josh Sandoz. You may have heard of him. And he is the one who founded the International Therapist Directory. And he works with adult TCKs up in Seattle, Washington. And we were talking, and I said, what usually brings them to you? Because these are usually older adult TCKs. I said, what usually brings them to you? And he said, subconscious expectations. He said they started adulthood thinking and having this idea subconsciously that it was going to go one way, and now they're in their 40s and they're midlife and it hasn't gone that way. And so they're really disappointed and depressed and don't really know why. What fuels this is that they often have an expectation of what the best life is. This is because we are really great at hyping up the TCK life. And we make it sound like it is the only way to do life if you want to live a good one. We talk about it as being so unique and awesome and wonderful and all these things, which is true. But what if they don't get to live that life with their own kids? What if they choose a career that causes them to stay in one country for a long time? I have talked to TCKs, adult TCKs, who said, I am worried that I did the most exciting part of my life before I was 18, and now it's just downhill. There's nothing left to look forward to. If there's expectation that that is the best life, it's really difficult to live life if you're not recreating that life. And sometimes recreating that life isn't possible. Sometimes there are expectations of how adult life should go. The expectation often, and this is true for most first world TCKs, is that they live their TCK life. They go back to their passport country to go to university. They graduate and get a career. They get married. And then they live their life as a monocultural individual. That's the expectation of how life should go. And so they feel like they're supposed to live up to these expectations, but then there's this other part of them thinking, and well, I guess I already did the best part of my life. And so you have these counteracting subconscious expectations. Sometimes it's about expectations of the new place. That could be the new place that they're moving to. That could be the university they're going to. That there's expectations of what the new place is going to be like. And if the new place doesn't meet those expectations, then they're not doing well. And then it could also be expectations of self. TCKs have really high standards for themselves oftentimes. They often feel like they have a really high bar that they have to meet, that they have to perform, that they have to do really well academically or in hobbies or whatever else. And so they have these really high expectations of themselves. In life, talking about the expectation of the expat life is the best contributes to those subconscious expectations. We need to be careful how we're talking about it. Also, talking negatively about those who haven't had overseas experience. We talk about it negatively. Sometimes it's unconsciously demeaning. But what happens if that TCK has kids one day who don't get to be TCKs? What messaging are they going to be replaying in their mind? And then lack of realistic expectations for relocation. If there weren't realistic expectations and they thought that they were going to be relocating and something amazing was going to happen and then it didn't, then what? For self, there's a constant sharing of and praising of performance. TCKs often feel like they are put on a stage and they are expected to perform. This is true whether they're missionary, whether they're military, whether they're foreign service. Usually TCKs have some sort of elite position in society and they are praised and they're also constantly being shared about. I had a teenage TCK tell me when we were talking about this, I said, what do you think makes that happen? What do you think makes you have those subconscious expectations that you have to be perfect all the time or always do things that are praiseworthy? And he said, well, I mean, I have to always make sure there's something worth putting in the newsletter. All right, well, that would feel that, wouldn't it? There's high excelling tendencies of expat children in general. And so when you're in a population where everyone is excelling to a high level, it creates that tendency that you will too. That's not a bad thing, but we do need to keep that in check. And then expectations of the self in the new place. Sometimes there's this thought of I'm going to recreate myself in this new location and what the expectation of what that will be like is. So we want to be careful how we talk about the expat life. We want to be careful that we're not over defending it. We're not saying, well, it doesn't matter that it's really hard and really sad. It's the best life ever. We want to be careful that we're not over praising, that we're not just talking about the positives and just talking about the best parts. We don't want to downplay the difficult. Again, sometimes the things that we say when we're trying to help them to feel better involve saying things like, well, yeah, it's hard, but you get to live such a better life than those poor monocultural kids back there who never left their passport country. We want to be careful to praise character over performance. This is a really easy switch, and this is something that I talk to parents about doing in their newsletters. Absolutely, talk about your kids in your newsletters, but be careful to praise their character instead of their performance. Instead of saying, we are so proud of Hannah because she is the best at learning the language out of all of us, and she's doing so well, and she is going to be fluent faster than the rest of us. Instead of saying that, saying we are so proud of Hannah's hard work and perseverance in learning the language, and it's helped her to build relationships in the community, and we're so proud of her diligence in doing that. You see the difference? It's just a slight change, but it's praising the character behind it instead of the result. We want to provide realistic expectations of the new country. One thing I see some parents do is that they provide really unrealistic expectations to make it not seem so bad for the kids who don't want to move. And so they will promise things, or they will say things like, I remember my dad, and he was not doing this because it was a bad thing. But I remember him saying before we moved to Africa, maybe we would be able to get a pet monkey. And so that was what we were looking forward to, is we get to get a pet monkey. We did not get to get a pet monkey because that wasn't actually a thing that we could do when we were living in Arusha. Funny story is we ended up getting one years and years later. But when we first moved there, that was the thing of like, we get to get a pet monkey. That was an unrealistic expectation that had not been researched by my father, who promised this to us, right? So we need to be careful about expectations of the new country and setting realistic expectations. We need to talk about the pros and cons of overseas versus passport country life. There are good things and hard things about any way of doing life, and it is okay to talk about the good things and the hard things of each. I love to play the what if game with kids, and I would encourage you to put this on your list of good ideas. The what if game is just saying, what if you lived in one house in Kansas and you never moved your whole life? What would be good about that, and what would be hard about that? What if you moved every single year? Every year around Christmas, you moved. What would be good about that? What would be hard about that? What if you moved every 4 years? What would be good about that? What would be hard about that? The idea being, there is no way that is considerably better than another. There are pros and cons to all of them. And it's really helpful for TCKs to process through that when often the messaging is this is the best option. So in all of this that we have talked about, and we are wrapping up here, in all of this, we are aiming for healthy TCKs. We want healthy TCKs who are thriving adults who can be wonderful contributing members of society and amazing caregivers for their own family, for others around them. And healthy TCKs have to feel, process, and resolve their grief, because it's through that they develop their ability for empathy, connection, and compassion. They have pieces of their identity that remain anchored even while they skillfully adapt to the cultures around them. They've learned how to control their need for change instead of letting it control them, know how to combat their restlessness in healthy ways, and allow themselves to be settled in the necessary areas of life. And they're aware of their subconscious expectations of life and of themselves, and have learned to offer themselves grace for their imperfections and develop contentment in their lifestyle. So that is what I have for you. And I hope that that was a helpful talk, and that you came away with a lot of practical information. I know that's a lot of content, and pretty much everything that you heard in this workshop, we have a workshop that goes deeper on that one topic. So feel free to reach out. We also do private trainings, individual sessions, and that sort of thing. So anything that you need from us, we'd love to serve you in any way. But does anyone have any questions? We have some time left.
Yeah, I have a few.
Perfect. Good.
I just don't know how much time to eat up. But one thing was maybe I came in a couple minutes late. Did you say how to get these slides? Because that wasn't on the handout that came with the email.
Yes, we don't give the slides out, but we do give the handout. So,
All right. The other thing, just wanted to confirm for counseling recommendations, would it just be to go through that TCK therapy website that you linked to from your for children, adolescents looking to get where to direct them for therapy?
yeah, we have a list. So I think there's a couple on the website, but if you want our extensive list for follow-up care, I'm super happy to send that to you. If you want to send me an email, otherwise I will forget.
At
But send
lauren.wells
me
at
an email.
tcktraining.com.
Yeah,
Okay.
we have a list that we give out for the debrief certification training for follow-up care recommendations. And I'm very happy to send that your way.
Okay, and then I find this middle age loophole, or I don't know what you call it, but there's really good resources for adult TCKs or college age TCKs. And then there's the transit lounge for middle school and high school for 1 week. And that's it. And so for middle school and high school kids that come back, well, I know that there's a Friday morning group that meets online, but for kids who attend school outside of the home, and then they canceled for the summer. They took a break for the summer, which would have been the one time a lot of kids can participate. So I was wondering if you knew of any resources, because that was, the transit lounge, there was nothing set up for those kids to connect. Now, if they're going to college, it's perfect because there's retreats for adult TCKs through what's it called, Compass, and there's different places. But do you have any recommendations for middle school and high school kids and how they can find other TCKs?
Yeah, so my recommendation used to be Kaleidoscope, but they are taking a long break, at least until January. And so I'm not sure what is going on with them other than I know they're on sabbatical. This is a gap. So to be completely honest, what you are highlighting a gap in TCK care, and that is for TCKs who are not yet headed to university to have excellent care. And one way that we are filling that gap is through working with parents and doing debriefing with them, but they need to be able to access each other. So we know that that's a gap. I don't know. We're kind of waiting to see what Kaleidoscope does to see how we can fill that gap if we need to. But I have no recommendations at this point because that is certainly a gap that needs to be filled. If anyone wants to start an organization, I highly recommend it. That's what we need. Yes, Rosalind.
In the UK, we have a multi-agency group called Reconnect that runs week-long debriefs in the summertime for kids who are returning, mainly for kids who are returning for long periods rather than just home assignment. But they're extremely valuable. There's one for sort of primary age and one for 11 or 12 to 18. And they're superb, really well run.
Yeah, thank you for that.
I've
heard very good things.
Yeah, I was just going to say our organization has a church in Colorado that kind of took us under, and their youth group and their youth ministry leaders are super interested in this kind of thing. So I don't know if there are any other churches or groups that are particularly good at that and have seen a need. I'm sure they'd be open to more than just our organization's kids, but they meet at least quarterly, if not more, just to bring people back together and to talk with the kids, middle school, high school. They even do elementary school stuff sometimes.
That's great.
I had one more question, and maybe it's because it doesn't create as many problems, but I wonder if you don't run into just as many, or at least a subset of kids who respond, instead of seeking change all the time, they're afraid of change. And avoid change because of histories of not being involved in decisions or changes being traumatic. So therefore they want to have ultimate consistency. Is it just because that tends to not be as debilitating because life inherently has some change that we don't focus on that as much, or have you not seen it much?
So what we actually see is that they will put their foot down and not make changes in certain areas. So you do have TCKs who will say, I am not changing, I am not moving, and they will stay in one place. But if you look deeper, we'll see that there's something else that they're regularly changing. And they're either regularly changing jobs, or they move houses a lot, or they I was teaching a couple of weeks ago, and there was a lady, we were talking about that, and she said, well, what about me? And I said, because she was saying, I wanted the stability. And so I've been in the same house for 20 years, married to my husband for 20 years. We haven't gone anywhere. And I said, well, usually there's something that creates that consistent change. And she goes, oh my goodness, I have had a new baby every 2 years my whole life. They have like 10 kids. And so they had a new baby every 2 years. And so that creates constant change, right? So it usually comes out in some way, even if they're determined to not have change.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a 30-year-old who still recognizes the fact that every 3 years or so he has a massive urge to pack up and go somewhere else. He's resisting it for the moment, but it's definitely there.
Yeah, it is hard. I experience that frequently, where I'm thinking, all right, that was fun, let's try something else.
What's next?
And you alluded at the beginning of it's not always feasible, like where you're living or whatever, to get connected with TCKs. But you said, is there a course or a follow-up to that comment as far as how you would advise helping TCKs build relationships with non-TCKs?
Yeah, so a lot of it has to do with that identity anchor piece, and helping them to figure out what's on their identity anchor, that they can also look for somebody else who has those similar things. And then another part of it, and I think we're doing a workshop on this next year, but another part of it is helping to strip away those myths and beliefs that they can't connect deeply with people who aren't TCKs, because some of that is built. Some of that has been taught to them. And so having conversations about how relationships are formed differently, but it's not bad. And it also doesn't mean it can't go deep. It just happens in different ways. So let's talk about how that might happen, and that sort of thing.
Are there other resources? You mentioned one activity you play with kids. Do you have another workshop or a place where you list like tons of different activities? Just because we kind of create our own, but we need help.
Yeah. So our debrief certification training comes with all of our debriefing content, and it's a ton of activities and worksheets and a whole folder of content for teens, for kids. So that is an option. The other thing that we have is our family curriculum, and our family curriculum we have for elementary and then for teenage. And that is for parents to use with their own kids. But that could be a really helpful thing, and you are also welcome to use it with the kids that you're serving. We do ask that you buy the organizational package for that instead of the individual family one. But yeah, those would be two places. We have tons of activities and worksheets and all sorts of things that are very interactive. And then we have, so as far as the family curriculum. So the first version is the one that's available right now, but in 2022, there will be a new one, and it's not updated. It is an entirely new one full of new activities and new worksheets and new things. So there will be another one coming next year that has more.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'm going to answer Sharon's question in the chat. Let's see. What does parents modeling emotional intelligence and processing without oversharing or being overwhelming to their kids look like, particularly little ones? Yeah. So we do need to be careful that we are not putting things on our kids and causing them to take on our emotions, right? That's something that we don't want to do. And so what we do want to do is a lot of explaining. So sometimes showing, but more explaining. So for example, if you are crying and your child is there, saying things like, yeah, mommy's getting a little teary because I'm really sad about this happening. And sometimes it's really good to just let yourself cry. Does that ever happen to you? And so make it more of a teaching moment than you explaining all that's going on inside you. So again, like we talked about with journaling or that sort of thing, if your kids are coming up to you when you are journaling, and if your kids are anything like mine, they're coming up touching you and saying, mommy, can I have whatever, and they just are talking, to be able to say, hey, mommy needs some time right now. I have a lot that's in my head that feels really big, and it helps if I get it out of my head and onto the piece of paper. And so that's what I'm doing here, and I need some time to do that. So trying to think of it like that, like you are using it as a teaching moment and less like you're putting your emotions on them. I also encourage you to not share in detail what you're putting in your journal, but the fact that that's what you're doing as you're journaling. Does that make sense? I hope that's a helpful differentiation there. Any other questions? We have no more minutes, but if anybody has a last question, I will take that and then we'll get going.
So many.
All right. Well, feel free to get in touch. You can use my email, lauren.wells@tcktraining.com. Info@ goes to Elizabeth, who's the business and personnel director, and she answers all of the logistics questions, which is amazing. And like I said, we have lots of resources. We are really great at when people say, hey, we don't know what we need. Here's the problem we're trying to solve, at saying, all right, I think probably a training would be best. And then maybe this or maybe this. So we love to have those conversations. So if you want to set up a Zoom meeting or anything like that, we'd love to have that conversation. And thank you so much for your time today. I hope this is a good
Thank you. It's very
use
helpful.
of.
Thank you so much, Lauren.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.